We'll be starting in 1 minute. Tēnā koutou, it is 10 o'clock, if people can please sit. And we will start the Infrastructure Services Committee meeting of May 9th, 2022. As of the start of this meeting, there were nobody was wishing to speak at public forums, so we can go straight to item number 2, which is apologies. We have apologies from Councillor Hall and Councillor Barker. I move we accept those. Second, Councillor Walker. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you. Confirmation of the agenda. We will be moving item 9 on to the Finance and Council Control meeting due to a missing item from the attachments. So I move that the committee confirms the agenda with the alteration that item 9 has been moved to the Finance and Council Controlled Organisations meeting of May 10th. So I have a second to Councillor Lord. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Very good, that's carried. Declarations of interest. Do we have any changes of declaration of interest from any of the members? Therefore, I move that the committee notes the members' interest register attached as attachment A and confirms the proposed management plan for the members' interest. So, second to Councillor Radich. All those, I'll put it. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Confirmation of minutes. Item 5. I move that the committee confirms the minutes of the Infrastructure Services Committee meeting held on the 4th of April 2022 as a correct record. Second to Councillor Staines. Any questions related to those minutes? Okay, I put it. I move it then. Anybody want to comment? And I put it. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Part A reports. Item 6, actions and resolutions of Infrastructure Services Committee meeting. Do we have any questions on that item? Okay, then I move that the committee notes the open actions from resolutions of Infrastructure Services Committee meeting shown in attachment A. Second to Councillor Staines. Get you to second, Councillor Radish. Any comments? It's just misspoke, it's just looking at the camera. Okay. Those on Zoom, by the way, I keep forgetting we have members coming in on Zoom, so if you really need to get hold of me, make sure you wave your hand vigorously in case I do not pay attention. And other people will keep an eye out for me as well. Okay, I'll put it. Okay, if you actually text Miss Sullivan too, if I'm not noticing you, and that she will let me know. Okay, I'll put item 5. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Item 7, Infrastructure Services Committee Forward Work Programme. Do we have any questions? Very good. Okay, I'll move then that the committee notes the Infrastructure Services Forward Work Programme as shown as attachment A. Anybody need a seconder? Councillor Staines. Anybody wish to speak? Therefore, I'll put it. All those in favour? Aye. All those against? Carried. On to Part B reports. Now, this is Part B report is ahead of the Part A reports in this meeting. Item 8, funding opportunities for Three Waters Strategic Work Programme. Ms Graham and Mr Drew, and I think Mr Logie as well. Just got to get to it myself. Once you've got yourself comfortable, do you have anything you wish to say to the report, or take it as read?
No, I don't think so, councillors, but we're happy to take questions, of which I'm sure there will be many.
I'm sure there will be. Questions? Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. And thank you for the report. Just for the benefit of the meeting, given how scarce Part B items are now, can you talk through what the process is from the decision that is made today and the meeting later this month?
Certainly through the chair, and I'll just give a quick explanation. So normally this committee considers Part A items, which means the committee has the ability to make decisions. This is a Part B item, so it's an infrastructure item, but because it relates to budgetary matters, it falls to council to make the final decision. And so the committee is recommending our position to council, and at the deliberations meeting in the end of May, 2 weeks, council will then confirm or otherwise the recommendations from ISCOM. So it's a slightly different process than normal.
Thank you. So it will come back as a report for confirmation, or how will it be presented?
No, depending on the decision, it will either form part of a budget paper or the operating budgets for Three Waters, or the capital paper if it relates to or the debt paper, or the debt considerations for the annual plan, depending on what council decides.
Yeah, thank you. And a question perhaps for Mr. Logie around the appetite for various options. To what degree is the uncertainty of the debt transfer the driving factor in the recommendations here, or put to us that a slightly different way? Were there to be certainty around the debt transfer as part of the transition, would the recommendation be any different? Or for either of you?
The recommendation, we would have considered it slightly differently, but funding OPEX from debt is not something that we generally do here, and so that would always be my concern, and we might have crafted it slightly differently. The option that is presented would still have been my recommended option, but we may not have been as opposed to the debt option in that case. But on balance, Gavin, I'm not.
And would it obviously change the advantages, disadvantages of the debt option?
Yeah.
One of the challenges that potentially a decision in this area could affect is our ability to have a balanced budget. Yeah. So depending on where we end up following deliberations or the decision in relation to this matter, will be dependent, because this will be an operating cost. If there's no associated revenue, then obviously it comes straight off the bottom line. So we have a reduced surplus.
That would be the case if we went with option 2.
Correct.
But not if we went with
option 1, if it's funded, then there would be a corresponding income line. So it would be fiscally neutral.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to move the recommendations in due course.
I'll move it, but I'll be moving that recommendation.
At what point was that signal, Mr. Chairman?
Oh, well, you may move it, Your Worship, then.
Thanks.
Councillor Van der Vis.
On page 33, it says, under recommendations, that staff will bring further report to council with a plan for consultation on the remainder of the Better Off funding package. Why would we consult after the event?
Councillor, I'm sorry if that's not clear, but that is for, this report is looking to spend or to allocate $8.8 million of, what is the total, Gavin? 46. Of 46. The report would be for the remainder, which is, can you do the maths? 35 million, give or take.
So that's actually a decision we could make post-consultation.
I'm sorry. So there are 2 tranches of money.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah. So we're proposing that the majority of the first tranche is applied to Three Waters, and that the second larger tranche involves a consultation with the community about what they might like to apply that money to other than Three Waters. And
we could make that second decision after we get the results of that consultation?
Correct.
Okay. Moving to page 35. it says under 13 that while the government's reform proposals continue to evolve, does this continuing to evolve reference the shameless about turn that MP Mahuta has made in moving from an opt-in to opt-out option to actually force councils into Three Waters? Is this what's referred to with continuing to evolve?
No, Councillor, and through the chair, that means that, for example, we've yet to see the first formal version of the draft bill, which we're expecting to see in Parliament, and so that will be the next evolution, will be draft legislation.
So why are we making decisions in advance of that, given the extraordinary evolution that we've already seen of the Three Waters proposal?
If I may, through the chair, because as the report says, the underlying issues that need to be resolved for council, including the investment or otherwise in ensuring that we meet the new regulatory requirements of the new operator, and the need to have plans in place for the delivery of ongoing renewals in the Three Waters space, don't change regardless of the government's program.
Right, so the government's program then, as you see it, the new standards will be set in stone, and we have already basically accepted that that will be the case?
I don't really know if the CEO can answer that question, to be honest.
But the regulatory framework has been clearly
Well, yeah,
identified.
Tomato ROI exists, right?
Yes.
So we've got the regulatory framework. So I guess your question is, what does it relate? How does your question relate to this item when it comes to the fact that Tomato ROI already exists and that we have to already meet its regulations?
What I'm wondering is why we are moving so quickly to meet regulations that we don't yet know what they are.
I can clarify that we do know what the regulations are. That bit we do know. And that the report, I think, says, and I'm sorry, I can't find the exact paragraph, that we need to work out a way to meet our obligations under the new regulatory framework, regardless of the decision you take at this point.
Yes, yeah, I understood that as well. Never mind, I'll move along. In the second part of that sentence, while the government's reform proposals continue to evolve, the underlying rationale for implementing this program remains. Is the underlying rationale the 34,000 waterborne disease cases claimed by central government? Is that what is driving this program?
No, and through the chair, the report talks to the original report to council in, was it 2020? Which is in attachment 1 or 2 of your papers, summarises in great detail the rationale for the program, and those reasons still remain true. And basically, it is to set the city up as best we can for when the new entity, whatever shape that is set up, that we are in a position where we can ensure that we give the best possible water services to our city.
So the reduction of waterborne disease, which has been widely advertised by government, is not part of the underlying rationale for implementing the program.
What we, as a provider of water to our residents, try always to provide safe drinking water. So that is an underlying driver for the service that we deliver, and we are, very successful in doing that. And so that is just a given. It's not one of the underlying rationales. What we're trying to ensure is that when the new entity takes over, we have plans in place that mean Dunedin residents will be given a level of service by the new entity that we think they warrant.
Thank you. Going to page 33 again, in the executive summary, it talks about the Three Waters strategic work program that the council has come up with. It also talks about the government Three Waters program. In 4 it says development of the program identified that regardless of the outcome of the government's Three Waters delivery service reform, further investment is still required in Three Waters. This program that's referred to, is this the council program or the government program?
It's the councils.
If we go then on the same issue to 10 on the next page, 34, it says, in parallel, the Three Waters Group has facilitated DCC interaction with and responses to the government Three Waters reform program. I'm having trouble seeing differences between the government's Three Waters program and the DCC program.
That should have been a little p, that's the government's.
Sorry, the
10 refers to the government's program, so that should have, in editing, that should have had a small p, which should have provided clarity.
okay. Now, but the question really is, what is the fundamental difference between the recommended option from the government's, the recommended option from the council program and what the government wants us to do? I'm having difficulty seeing this as anything other than a tick-off for MP Mahuta's Three Waters program.
You are sort of heading towards a speech rather than questions, so you might I'd ask you if you just reserve your
what
words
are the
for either
differences
side of
between
that part of the
what's
item.
proposed in the
I can show you which
assumed
attachment,
recommendation?
Simon, Mr. Drew, which attachment shows our work program? That is attachment E. So page 89, this is the program.
And it differs from the government program in what respect,
Well, I think
fundamentally?
Fundamentally, if you look at it, you can see.
Well, I've looked at the fundamentals and to me they all seem to be identical. They all seem to be, let's meet these new standards yet to be imposed. Let's give governance...
You aren't asking a question at this point.
Yeah, and the standards have been imposed, the regulator has been set up, and we are now required to meet those standards. And the program that is outlined here, we believe, gives us the best chance of meeting those standards. And Council in 2020 agreed with the advice that that was the best way forward. And it has taken, as the report outlines, a little bit more time than we might have hoped to get this in front of Council for a variety of reasons. And we've now brought it back to Council with saying, you asked us to do this, here's how we intend to do it, and here's how we think we should pay for it.
Okay, finally, if we have a change of government at the next election, and that change has already been strongly suggested that they will simply scrap Three Waters, where does that leave us in terms of making this decision today? Have you considered that we may not have the same obligations with the next government that we are currently trying to accede to in this paper?
The regulator has been set up, and anything that staff have heard does not indicate that the regulatory framework will change.
Despite
The
this
regulatory
paper saying that government's reform proposals continue to evolve.
Absolutely, but that is, as I've answered already, that evolution isn't around the regulations. That is already done. The evolution is around the structure and the size and scale of the various Three Water entities. That bit hasn't been done. The regulatory section is in place, and nothing we have read or heard from central government indicates that is likely to change if there were to be a change in government.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lord.
Thank you, Chair. I was a bit ambivalent about whether I thought option 1 or option 2 was best, and I understand that you would normally not fund OPEX through debt, but what I was trying to understand with the disadvantages suggested in option 2, it says, with uncertainty over how the debt transfer to will transfer to the new water entity, there was a possibility of a stranded debt of up to 8.8. And I'm just wondering, is the reason you've written that line because the 8.8 would not be tagged to a specific capital work and because it's operational expenditure?
But that aside, it is still unclear as to how the government will set the level of debt that it's happy to take over into those entities. So that has not been prescribed. So whether there's going to be a formula, whether it's going to be they'll take our number, there's a multitude of things, but it's still unknown. So by stranded debt, what we mean is potentially the government could say to us, we will not take over that portion of your debt, which means it stays with the DCC, without the corresponding income.
I understand what you meant by stranded debt. I totally get that, but I was just meaning in terms of why that would be a problem. Now, so my next question then would be, you've just said that you don't know how it's going to happen, and it says that in the report too, that we're unclear. Is there a risk that we might have other potentially capital projects that we've invested in that we would still have some of that debt on our books? Is that a potential risk?
Again, until the government confirms how the debt will be calculated for the transfer, there is always a potential for us to have stranded debt in relation to our Three Waters activity.
But surely it's not how the government determines it, it should be how we determine it, shouldn't it be? I mean, if I was selling you a property with a mortgage, the mortgage would be the mortgage.
Through the Chair, the transition arrangements, as Mr Logie has said, are still not clear, and how debt will be apportioned is one of the things that I think is a risk that is yet to be fully understood.
Even more reason why we should not lie down and accept this.
That's why there's clear officer advice that we don't debt fund this option for that reason, and if we can't access government funding, then we will come back to council, or if debt funding does become something that seems reasonable and really clear and this would qualify, then we would look to just reconfirm the decision with council, but nothing that we've read indicates.
So we know that there's two tranches of money. Now, are these contestable funds, or is there a certain percentage that's allocated to our council?
No, so the number, and again, I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's in here, has been allocated based on a formula that's been applied nationally.
Yep, and that's of both funds?
Yep. So it's in here, that's the one it's 40 plus million, 46 million in total.
So the other question then I ask is, if we chose to go for option B and allocate this from debt, and if we use that money for something else, just pick a figure, say something like to make the new Mosgiel pool better, or to finish a bit of the Peninsula Road or something like that, then if we were somehow in a situation where we did get left with that stranded debt, we would be no worse off anyway, because we would have paid for the other work. Would that not be correct, if we've used it for a capital item?
Again, through the Chair, that would be dependent on the conditions of how they're going to allocate the $46 million. So there is very specific criteria, i.e. at this stage it appears you can't use it to fund an existing piece of work within your 10-year plan.
Okay, yep, thank you then.
Can I just follow up Councillor Lord's question from another direction? If we were to go to option one and access this money, and then there was a change of environment, which might be a change of government or a change of plan, and then this fund was withdrawn, do you know what would happen with the councils who have accessed that money?
No, I don't have any information on that. I'm sorry, Councillor.
Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I had questions around stranded debt and debt in general, and they've largely been answered, but I might ask a wee bit about the council debt. But just so there's clarity around the table here, I think it's important for me to ask that we have regulatory obligations that we must adhere to whatever the hue of the government. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah. And in terms of the council debt, we all know that if this goes ahead, our council debt will be transferred to Entity D, and I think the papers make it really clear there's a lot of uncertainty around that particular facet of what's going to happen. Is there any indication when that will be less opaque, when we'll have a better understanding? Because it's important, certainly for Mr Logie, to know that information.
No, we have no clarity at this point. The sense I get from the sector is everyone is anxious to have it, and I think central government are aware of the anxiety, but at this stage we have no sense of when we might get that clarity.
Okay, great. And I guess nervousness amongst most TAs will relate to potential for stranded debt. So that's probably one of the strongest arguments, I guess, against option 2. I mean, maybe to miss.
I can't comment on what
Yeah,
the anxiety is for other TAs, but
Okay.
but I do know that many of them are choosing to use this money for non-Three Waters related activities.
Your Worship.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's another iteration of the question around the wider political risk apropos of events later next year. Were we to debt fund this work and then there was a change of government that, to use their own language, scrap the reform program, that would also include, I assume, scrapping any intention to take over the debts that councils have incurred. So that is a... So if were we to go with option 2, then that is a different risk in terms of the central government direction, is it not?
It would seem to be.
Thanks.
Councillor Radich.
Thank you, Chair. Do you have any idea if there will be an equalisation screen applied to this council debt, item 17, as previously asked by Councillor Vandervis? Or has that already been applied in determining the 46 million? And what I'm getting at is that, there's a range of council spend that goes to Three Waters historically, both OPEX and CAPEX, and we've got debt in the whole council system, but it's not necessarily directly related to Three Waters. So how is that calculated, or has an equalisation screen to try and even out the amount of money given to councils, authorities throughout the country? Has that already been applied, or will it be reapplied in the next lot? So it's been applied. There's been an equalisation screen applied to the application, to the handout of the money that we're getting now, the 46 million in 2 tranches. But will there be a similar equalisation screen in your expectation or not applied to how debt is taken into the authorities?
We don't
the
know,
entities?
Councillor.
Okay, that's fine.
So we don't know how debt will be taken in, and we do know that the funding allocations, that a nationally consistent formula was applied.
Yes, but it was an equalisation screen as opposed to just per capita or one only factor, yeah?
No, it was a basis of population and geographic area.
Page 82 of the report
Yes,
has the breakdown of the...
So it's more than just one criteria. Currently on the books, what is our Three Waters debt? Because of course we have a large amount of debt in council, but not all of that is Three Waters.
So it's around, at the moment it's around 120 million. Obviously we haven't completed for this financial year.
Yep.
So we'll do a wash up at the end of this financial year once we look at the funding impact statement for Three Waters.
Yes.
Particularly given that Three Waters this year have overspent, well not overspent, but have spent more than their capital budget on their renewals.
But that increase in expenditure has been debt funded, is that correct?
Correct.
Right, so, and we don't know what the formula is, but there's probably a level of expectation there, is there?
We
The government would
we
assume
just
that
don't
needs to-
know, Councillor, what
Yes.
they will take and what the basis of that will be yet.
Yes, but one of the things with debt, I mean, there's a consolidated fund, but things are allocated in their various buckets. Is it feasible to allocate incoming or new fresh debt for, work on Three Waters to, well, is it feasible to allocate work done on the Three Waters reforms like this and allocate it to the Three Waters debt bucket? And
We
then,
don't have debt buckets, Councillor. I've got him before Mr Logie did.
Yeah, however, just so we're clear, we can allocate. So each year we do what we call a funding impact statement, which is effectively as a cash flow statement that says this is the money that each group earned and this is the money that it spent, and then the difference has to be funded by either external income. So for roading, for example, it comes from NZTA funding. For Three Waters, it would be debt funded.
but whilst we're We don't have debt buckets. We do have a larger amount of debt than 120 million. So what are the chances of the government transferring all of our council debt to the new entity?
Zero, I would think, councillor.
Exactly. Thank you.
Just following up on Councillor Radler's question and your answer on buckets. It's true we don't have a debt bucket, but it is also true that the government, if it goes ahead with the entity reform, will be coming after a very specific set of assets. And so I guess the question would be, really, can we ascribe, especially the forward spending program, to those assets?
And that's what Mr Logie suggests we're working on at the minute.
So effectively, when we were asked for information as part of the Three Waters reform program, we provided a debt figure for Three Waters. We have then kept track of that debt, and we'll continue to do so over the next 3 years, so that when we do get to the point, or 2 years, so that when we do get to the point, we will have a debt number. What the government does with that piece of information is yet to be determined, which is what the Chief's referred to in terms of the allocation of debt. I mean, they may do it on assets, so there'll be some councils that don't have debt specifically tagged to Three Waters, but they will feel potentially aggrieved if they don't get anything other than shares in the company. So again, until the government clearly articulates how it's going to calculate the debt, whether it takes our view on what the debt is or whether they apply a formula. If you look at the funding, they've applied a formula based on population. I mean, who knows?
Thank you.
The questions, I'll ask another. So what you're saying, that if we debt fund the Three Waters work, there is a chance the government would take that into the new entity. Whereas if we don't debt fund that work, there's no chance.
Well, that is true in a weird kind of way, and I mean that because it's equally possible that they won't take the debt.
I have Councillor Wiley and then Councillor Houlihan. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. On page 37, point 35, it talks about the GC allocation is 11.54 million for tranche 1 qualified. Sorry, that's the wrong question. The funding, point 36, is when we talk about this allocation, it says the money is essentially available from July 1. So if we had an application in July 1, do we get the money essentially July 2?
My sense, and through the chair and working with the DIA, it's never quite that straightforward.
Correct, yeah. But the money comes pretty quickly, and as long as we have the application by September.
Look, we would have to work through whatever process the DIA has in place, and it's likely to involve, and I think we outlined that as one of the considerations. There'll be a whole series of applications, reporting requirements, and certainty that we're required to give them, including signing an agreement on how the funds will be spent, etc. So it won't be quick, but we can expect to get it, in the financial year that we budgeted.
Okay, and then next page over, page 38, a question for Mr. Drew, point 39, paragraph 39. The budget includes funding for 15 extra FTE required to deliver the work. I've heard in the past that there's such a shortage of water people, so what's the likelihood of finding 15 people to assist in doing this work?
Yeah, that's correct, Councillor. There is challenges recruiting experienced Three Waters staff, but we've taken that into account in developing the program, and we don't expect to have the full 15 in the organisation this year. We'll gradually build that capability and capacity.
And I guess the 4.4 million will be enough, and I guess there would be obviously a premium being paid to that staff when it's also when we're competing with the government to pick up staff for water positions.
We'll pay, Councillor, fair salaries for the type of skills that we're recruiting.
Thank you.
Councillor Houlihan.
Thank maybe this has been covered. But I've also got a few questions off page 37 around, and I mean, it's very clear, looking at this, there's a lot of questions we haven't got answers to. Is it too early for us to take this vote, given that?
I think that's a matter of debate, Councillor. But it's for us to consider rather than staff to answer.
Well, staff have brought us this paper, but I'm just querying whether it's too early for us to decide this, because we haven't got so many answers. You know, there's so much we don't know, and if we say yes, we're not even really sure what we're agreeing to.
Well, if I may, through the chair, the report responds to a resolution of council from 2020, but option 3 is the status quo, which is the operate within existing budgets, which, if you thought it was too soon, is an option that is available to you.
Right. Is there a bit of urgency with this because of what Councillor Wiley mentioned before the deadline of July 1? Do we have to decide that, I assume, before then? Is that the case?
No, that's when the funding becomes available. The deadline for applications for tranche 1 is September.
Would it be fair to say that the time course that we're responding to is the establishment of Te Mata Arawai and the meeting of national regulation standards?
Correct.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Councillor, then I just, do you have any more questions?
What happens if we make this decision, say we go for option 1, and then we discover that, you know, the government isn't offering us anything near what we thought and things are quite different, because we could make this vote and we don't actually know what we're agreeing to?
I guess the question, I might just quickly jump in there. Wouldn't that imply then, Councillor Houlihan, that we would go for option 1 and try and get the government to put as much money up front?
So, can I just clarify, because we've got budgets for the next 10 years, has the government said at any point that it will cover those costs we've got set aside for Three Waters expenses over our next 10 years, or are we need to cover that? How does that work?
With the next LTP, depending on the pace of water reform, those budgets will no longer be council responsibility because we will be no longer delivering water services.
Is that after the 10 years?
No, that will be the next July 24.
Oh, 24. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I note that key to this process going forward is going to be our relationship with the relationship manager. And I note among the relationship managers are mentioned, and I note amongst them someone that used to work here at DCC and will have a background, a strong background in water. But I just wanted to know, do we already know our relationship manager? Do we have a relationship with that person? And can we be assured that all of those people, in particular ours, have that really skilled, deep background?
You're correct. We do know our relationship manager, and we are in constant communication with them over the existing stimulus funding.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Thank you.
And he is knowledgeable in the industry.
Sorry?
He's knowledgeable within the industry.
Oh, great. Excellent. Thank you. Second question is around the 15 FTEs, as mentioned on page 38, paragraph 39. And then further over on page 53, paragraph 40, it mentions 11.26 FTEs. Is that just a timing matter in terms of, I think it mentioned this year. And can you just reconcile those two figures for me, Mr. Drew? And also speak to the specific areas they'll need to work for in. I note that there's a lot of bureaucratic process that will provide a lot of extra work.
Correct. Sorry, where's the 11.3?
In the original report, Mr. Drew, for July 20, so things have changed slightly, and we've refined the program since then, so we have better clarity, and also we're delivering it in an even shorter period of time, so that means additional resource for a shorter period.
Excellent, thank you for that clarity. And another question, page 90, around asset ownership in our work program, can I assume that the public-private stormwater assets and who owns what part of it will be clear in that exercise?
This program allows us to resource that piece of work. To date, it's been difficult to progress that work.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Can I just follow up on Councillor Gary's last question, and the implication of that is if that work is not completed in time for the formation of the new entity and transfer of assets, what position will we be in at that point?
It would be my expectation that a water services delivery entity would want the entire network, so we would work through with the entity how that looks.
Councillor Elder.
In the context of high expectations and new regulations regarding three waters, including urban planning, etc., is a lot of this work needed to be done regardless of whether the reform happens or not?
That's correct, Councillor. Yep.
So in fact, regardless of whether reform happens or not, this piece of work will enable Dunedin to actually reach a higher bar when it comes to the planning and the implementation of our Three Waters program.
Correct. A large part of the program is to get the organisation better prepared for the new regulation and respond to it.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that. And therefore, in the context of us already needing to do that work, do you perceive this tranche of funding as an opportunity to progress this work in a more efficient and quicker manner?
And we do, and that's why the officer advice is to apply that funding to this work.
Thank you.
Councillor Van der Vis.
Just picking up on Councillor Houlihan's question, if we were to go for the status quo, which is option 3, what would be the downsides for us if we simply carried on the way we are, developing our water system as we have been? What would be the downsides to dragging the chain a bit, essentially?
The risk is that we are not able to meet the requirements of the new regulator. So that is the main risk for us, and some of those, regulations are now, we know what they are, we know what we're required to do. And so I think, Simon, that would be the biggest risk.
Correct, that's the main risk for us.
Are those requirements paperwork requirements or actual water quality requirements?
They are water quality requirements that involve some paperwork.
Thank you.
Following up on Councillor Van der Vis's question, does that imply then that I think it's 4.1 million per annum that we're looking at, right? That 4.4, that if we meet that, then we are now able to meet, in terms of the regulatory requirements and the safety standards that Te Mata Arawa is proposing, that we'll be able to meet them?
It puts us in the best possible position to be able to meet them.
Thank you. Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just it really relates to a couple of the earlier questions in paragraph 31. I understand, and thereabouts, I understand there's some lack of clarity around what the better off funding might be able to be applied for, but I'm confused by something. I might have misheard you earlier, Ms. Graham. And is it correct that the transition funding can be used for anything that's currently in the long-term plan? Or can...
I haven't made any comments, and I'm sorry if that's been unclear, about transition funding today.
You're only talking about the better off
Only
funding?
because we have no clarity at all about what transition funding can be used for.
All right. Thank you.
And just to clarify, we're going after better off funding if we go for option 1, right?
Correct.
Councillor Radich.
Yeah, just for clarity, further clarity, I mean, this whole paper is about the better off funding, is whether we're going to use it, whether we're going to use that better off funding for Three Waters or fund the Three Waters improvements from debt.
Indeed,
It's
the
all about
recommendation does say government funding, and that's in case transition funding does present an opportunity. If it does, we'll report back and see what the criteria are, and if it applies, and it might be that we switch which government funding bucket we use. But at this stage, we are saying we believe better off funding can be applied, and we think we should use that. If transition funding turns out to be an option, we'll bring back a paper giving an option of switching government buckets.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
I'm asking this in the context of our strategic capacity and our strategic decision making, and what drives that, particularly around urban development, land supply and the NPS, and the imminent work on the future development strategy with the ORC. So you can see where I'm coming from, because the concern has been expressed about one of the implications of a change in regular management structure would be that decisions would be made remotely that might not interface appropriately with our own strategic decisions about what and when and where. And I'm wondering if that conundrum can be coped with as part of this discussion as well, or has that already been taken into account?
A significant part of the program, the strategic work program, is around future investment planning. And so a significant part of it is trying to accelerate our current program from 4 years into 2 years to specifically align with the future development strategy. And that's driven by the decisions that have come out of the various plan changes and the Environment Court mediations that are still underway? Correct. Okay, thank you.
And the future development strategy being developed. Yep. Councillor van der Vis.
It's proposed that the government, when taking control over the Three Waters, would take over the DCC book debt of our Three Waters. Do we know what the current Three Waters book debt is and what the budgeted book debt is for 2024?
I think Mr. Logie has answered that already, but he'll...
I think I've already traversed that, so I think a figure of around 120 million was what we put into the reporting to the DIA, and as I've stated, is that what we will do is we will continue to track the level of debt that's attributable to Three Waters assets through the funding impact statements to ensure that we have a number that is a starting point from our point of view, but of course the government still has the right to determine what level of debt they're going to take over as part of that Three Waters reform program.
So are you saying that on our books we currently have 120 million and that we would simply track that? Have you got any idea, if, suppose the recommendation goes through, what that debt will track to for 2024?
No, I don't, Councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. I do like the word better off for better off funding. And talking to Councillor Benson-Pope's suggestion as well, when we take on that better off funding and we progress our plans speedily, does that mean that we will be better off because we have a more complete plan for the future of Dunedin when transition happens?
That would be a fair statement.
Councillor Gary.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify something that Mr. Logie answered in relation to a question from Councillor Lord, just so that I'm absolutely sure I understand this. So it's around the second tranche of better off funding, which we're not deciding today, but we will in future. And you answered that anything that was on, he was giving some examples, anything that's on in the 10-year plan wouldn't qualify. Did I get that correct?
Mr. Lowe, you might have said that, but there's a nuance in that, and it depends, and we're still trying to fully understand what it means. It might be that if you significantly accelerate something that is in your 10-year plan, it may qualify, but it may not. And so, again, we haven't had this information for that long, and the criteria in one of your attachments, and you'll see that they are broad and able to be interpreted, and so we'll try and creatively interpret them for tranche 2 funding.
So I have a further question in relation to that, in that we are going to get to a point where we're looking at the next long-term plan, and for example, not the only example, but for example, that unfunded section of the Peninsula Connection, yes, the project is in the current 10-year plan, but there's an unfunded section. We will be looking to put that in potentially in the 10-year plan, and if we do, that may mean it can't be considered for the better off funding. I'm assuming that the timing for that second tranche, and I just don't recall from the papers when that is, that we will have those answers before we get to decide what goes in that next 10-year plan.
Yes.
Good, thank you.
All things being equal, if the government keeps going forward at the pace it plans to move at, Three Waters will be out of the next 10-year plan, will it not?
Correct.
Thank you. Councillor Radich.
Yes. Speaking to a couple of elements of the questions we've just heard, we've got this $8 million to spend for better off funding, but we're looking at an advanced, an enhanced and sped up program of Three Waters improvements in response to the government's new regulator, which is what we're discussing here today. If we fund that from debt, that would quite fairly go on top of the 120 million, near enough, of Three Waters debt that we have already. So that would take us to 128 million. And then there is a chance that that could, depending on their criteria for absorbing debt, but it is quite fairly Three Waters debt. That could then be transferred to the new entity. Have I got that right?
You've got the maths right. Whether or not the level of debt transfers, we don't know.
Exactly. So we don't know that, but that opens the door for that possibility. So this being called better off funding, surely we would be, I mean, all the Three Waters assets are going to be transferred, 2.8 billion, and we'll get back the debt that we currently have. Surely, if we want to be better off, we could take that 8 million, for instance, and finish the Peninsula Connection, and then we would be better off after the assets are transferred. Would that be true to say or not? It's or that is too subjective.
That's not an officer
Yes.
question.
Thank you. That's all right.
Answer.
Councillor Walker.
A question just to provide some clarity to the conversation in the previous questioner. Although we're carrying roughly 120 million debt of Three Waters in our books at the moment, there's no reason why when the dust settles and the criteria are set, we don't only get 20 million back from the government, or 40 million, or 80 million. We just don't know. That's the problem.
Correct.
Yes, thank you.
Is that a government?
Councillor Radich.
Is that a governmental insight?
If I
think it's been covered a lot.
This is challenging because it's a bit circular, but we've tried to say in the paper we simply don't know what criteria the government will apply to debt transfer. They may choose to take, let's notionally say, $120 million and trust that that's fair, or they may cap it. They may apply a formula similar with 3 criteria in the same way that they have for the application of the better off funding. We simply don't know.
Have we exhausted questions? I waited for mine to see what was going to get asked, and most of them are missing. I mean, most of them have been resolved. Just actually one interesting thing on question 26D, in terms of program delivery, it says D, reducing risk to drinking water quality to a more acceptable level. Do we have an unacceptable level of drinking water quality?
So under the new regulations, there's a new water safety planning process. So it's far more prescribed than it has been in the past. We, staff from across the Three Waters group, have workshopped all the risks that are, could occur within the drinking water system, and there are a number of high risks, and so this program is trying to accelerate those high risks and remove them from our network.
If I may, there is acceptable drinking water quality or not. So that's your question.
My question really is it acceptable already?
Yeah. And so I think that maybe that is just probably not as well stated as an option.
It's predominantly systems, processes, reporting risk.
It was really a question getting to what Councillor Vandervis was alluding to earlier with the 35,000 claim by the government of people getting sick from drinking water, when 34,000 of those, if that is even the correct number, are getting it from roof water and rural supplies rather than reticulated city water systems. So I wanted to ask that question to be very specific about the water quality that we're delivering in terms of safety. So we have risks that have been identified, but we haven't had events.
No, we haven't had events.
It's been asked a couple of times. I see Councillor Wiley. I see you, Councillor Wiley. I'll get to you when I've finished. This is questions. About our DIA representative, who I think is Mr. Appledorn. And have you had conversations? You have had conversations with him already about this?
No, staff have had conversations. I have a meeting with him in the next couple of weeks.
Because looking through, I think it's attachment D, could be C. It's the government's Three Waters attachment on how to use the better off funding, and the examples are almost all wellbeing fundings. And my question is, if we then go to the DIA and say we're actually spending this on infrastructure and Three Waters, and they say actually no, actually it's not meant for that at all, it's meant for just wellbeing funding, is it that we'll end up just getting a paper coming back and saying that's what's happened?
Correct.
But our initial assessment in putting this report together is what we're proposing fits within the criteria that as they've been at a high level.
It fits in a high level criteria, but the examples are quite
Indeed,
different.
But they're examples only, and a lawyer will tell you that they are not determinative. So.
Yes, the lawyer will. It depends on whether it's the Appledorn does. A strategic question is, does using this money put us in a position of accepting the government entity reform program?
I don't believe that it does.
We still have the November position of being against the entity.
Correct.
Correct. I have a couple more, but I can't really find them easily, so I'll let Councillor Wiley have his question. And Councillor.
Thank you. A question for you, the Chair. You referenced the 34,000 people that got sick from drinking water. I understand that's from a 2007 report that really was written not for any true purpose for Three Waters or anything like that. It's not been peer reviewed and is essentially being picked up by Minister Mahuta and the government as a bit of a speaking note that they wanted to spread far and wide. Do you have any reference or commentary on that, or do you know anything further to that report?
I think you can get it from the parliamentary librarian. It was a report for the Department of Health by a graduate student at the University of Canterbury who was a water engineer doing it, and he made an estimate, and the upper estimate was 35,000. And then in the appendix, I I don't know the exact number, but over 90% of the cases were not urban reticulated water systems. And and the report was also back in 2005, so it was quite old.
And so essentially, through urban, I thought there was something like, the cases they quoted was like 34 out of Queenstown, and the rest were, as you quoted before, or mentioned before, was around home supply as such.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of straying out of the questions of this item, and I think maybe we'll leave it for speeches, but yeah, that's pretty much my take on it as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Van der Vis.
Given that this is a fairly significant decision, if we're to go with the recommended decision of approving the Three Water Strategic Program funded through government, and there's many millions of dollars involved, are we not obliged to consult with the public before making what is a significant decision?
No, and as the report says, we've assessed it in the decision before you does not trigger significance.
And the reason it doesn't trigger significance, despite the very, very significant billions that are involved,
so it's
inherent
a
in it.
$4 million decision year on year, when assessed against our operating budget, which is 350 million. It doesn't trigger significance, and it's fully funded.
You're talking about a very small part of the budget, but this here is approving the Three Water Strategic Work Program,
which is
funded through government.
Yeah, which is a $4.4 million program funded through the Better Off funding.
And you don't see that as actually essentially approving the whole Three Waters takeover?
No, that's certainly not what's
just
happening
part
here.
of it.
It's approving the program that council had previously agreed to, endorsed in 2020, and this is simply saying we believe that the best way of funding that program that council is already committed to is by making use of the government funding, which was not available in 2020.
How many millions would have been involved in this particular decision to make it significant enough to require consultation?
I don't know the answer to that, but this is essentially a decision to add 15 additional staff into the operation for a period of just under 2 years that is funded, externally funded. So it's a zero cost on rates. So when it's a zero cost on rates like that, it probably would really struggle to trigger significance.
Okay, finally, those 15 staff, would their positions be for 2 years or would they be permanent positions?
Likely permanent, but it would depend because there's a reasonable probability that they will transfer to the new entity.
So there's a reasonable probability, in fact, that we won't be able to employ them after 2 years.
Well, we won't need them after 2 years because given the way things are as of today, we won't have a water service that we are delivering.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow that question with trying to clarify a question, water reform from the government has had two phases to it. One is the regulator, and that phase is actually more or less over and completed and was received non-controversially through almost every council in the country.
Correct.
And then there's a second phase which is under play right now, which is the delivery system and who's going to deliver it, which is being referred to as the entities. Is that correct?
Correct.
And this item is reflecting the first phase, which is already completed and underway, and we are now responding to it. Well, in terms of the regulators, we are responding to what we think the regulator is going to require from us, and this will be.
To a large part, but it also does some of the work in the work program, and Mr. Drew can speak to it in more detail if required, does also do some of that planning work that is necessary for us to continue to deliver Three Waters infrastructure, whether that's us as DCC if we end up being the entity doing it, or whether it's a new entity under the second part of the government's reform package. But that planning work also needs to be done.
That's planning work, but it is agnostic to what goes forward with the entities, because it'll have to be done whether it stays with us or whether it goes to the entities, because it's actually part of the capital works program that would come back to the water quality that's been put forward by the government, as well as our asset management plan.
Correct, and also some of it goes to growth, as in response to an answer previously. So it's about accelerating that planning work that we haven't historically always done enough of or resourced adequately.
So I guess what I'm getting at with that question, just to get it really clear, is that it's not that bit that it's not responding to Te Mata ROI, which is a planning effectively, would be done no matter what's going on if we were behaving responsibly, whether an entity is going to form or not, because it's affecting growth, it's affecting asset management, it's affecting other aspects.
It does need to be done, which is what Council acknowledged in 2020 when they approved that report. It was just the best mechanism for funding it, because if it needed to be rates funded, for example, then we would have to weigh up all of the things that we are required to deliver and check whether this was then a priority when assessed alongside all of those others.
So when we're looking at options 1, 2 and 3, 3 would not achieve, if we were to go with 3, would not achieve the objectives that we are going for in terms of the strategic objectives or meeting the increased requirements from Te Mata ROI.
That's correct.
And then 1 and 2 are how are we planning on funding it.
That's also correct.
Thank you. Any more questions? His Worship has indicated he will move. I'll second it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is quite straightforward, I think, and nobody should argue about the importance of getting on with doing this work as per the decision that Council made in 2020. Even better that we can get someone else to pay for that. Because regardless of where the service delivery debate lands and who's in charge of water service delivery, this puts the network in the strongest possible position, and that is something that is in the best interest of our community. And the regulatory environment, as has been traversed, isn't really at risk through the next general election cycle, because the new regulatory environment was instigated by the previous national-led government, has been advanced by the current one, and has broad parliamentary support. So that isn't going to change. I don't see why then we would opt out of having government funding to help us meet the new standards. I agree with the recommendations that we should avoid debt funding our operating expenses where we can, and that we should avoid the risk of having an unbalanced budget where possible. And so the only option that we have that does both of those things and gets on with doing the work is option 1, the recommended option. It's entirely appropriate that the funding is applied to the Three Waters network. If you look at the criteria that they've set out for how it might be used, it's looking to support housing development and growth, support the low emissions transition, support placemaking and community wellbeing. How we invest in and plan our Three Waters network is essential to all three of those things, and so this, I think, should meet those criteria. I think there are far greater risks. The status quo isn't an option because we have new standards that we need to meet. So the only options really are the first two, and I think the risks of debt funding this work, given what we don't know about how debt will be treated, assuming the service delivery reform goes ahead, I think that's far too great a risk. What might otherwise be funded by the Tranche 2 funding will no doubt be a far more complex and colourful debate about how we wish to see that applied. But in this case, I think it's entirely sensible that it goes to progressing the work program that was signed off in 2020, and all the better that it is going to be funded by government to meet government's largely applied to meeting the new regulatory standards. Thanks.
Councillor Lord.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I have no concerns about some parts of this. I have concerns about others. I have no concern about the body of work that's being proposed. It's what we've asked for. It's what's been recommended by our Three Waters team, and I have complete confidence in them. And I was perhaps thinking that maybe option 2 was a better option, because I was thinking we could go and finish something like the Peninsula Road, use that money there, And if that money was then a stranded asset as allocated in the report for operation expenditure, if it was been something, we would still be no worse off because we would have got the other stuff paid that we wouldn't have had to pay through long-term rates. We would have been in a net sum gained. But I do have real concerns about the Three Waters program, and while I was very happy not to join CL4, and I think we made a good decision in that space, I have real concerns about how this Three Waters program is being put together, and the reality of the number of times that the CE's told us today, we just simply don't know, and I accept that. This is not a failing of our CE, as was perhaps suggested by one question, but this is a poorly thought out program and it's poorly planned. You couldn't have made a worse job of it if you wanted to. The reality of it is, and most New Zealanders probably are not accepting of, the fact that there is a very clear and necessary reason why we should be making some changes. But they've just made such a poor job of it, and they've gone back on their word, that they've made it very difficult for us as councils to even get that message across, that, you know, we've got a council just south of us that have got all their water, you know, they copped a $600,000 fine because their sewerage systems are just all not working. And then we see that mayor sitting there being so supportive of the program because he knows that they're going to be better off, when a council like us that have actually got some pretty good systems in place and we've spent some money, and as a result of it we've got some debt, and I accept that as a normal thing, but I just feel this whole process is being done so poorly, it's left us in a pretty sad position. But I'm happy to support the recommendations because that's still the best of a bad bunch, so thank you.
Councillor Radish.
This work is at the government's behest, but I agree with advancing that work. I think we're better to have the Three Waters infrastructure in better shape and ready for the takeover. I'm not that keen on the takeover, but we may as well get in line and get it ready, get our infrastructure ready for the new entity, and of course it is in line with the new regulator and regulations. So I think it's a worthwhile activity and it's worthwhile spending the money. However, I don't agree with using the government money, which they have given us for well-being and to make ourselves better off. I mean, to me it's like a nice little bribe to get us on board with the Three Waters, but they're also mandating it, so we have to be part of Three Waters. And it's far better for us to use that money for things that will leave us better off after the assets are taken away. And they're supplying that money for us, for well-being. If we fund this work through debt, there's a reasonable chance, possibly a 50-50 chance, that the government will take that debt into the new entity. If we fund it from their money, their well-being money, we will not achieve any increase in well-being, we will not be better off, but there is zero chance that the government will take that debt into the new entity. So we're far better to remove that risk. Why take the risk of waving goodbye to that $8 million? We're far better to debt fund this in the interim. We've got another $38 million coming in tranche 2. So our bases are covered. So we're far better to be funding this from debt in the interim. As it is, we've only got $120 million debt on our $2.8 billion worth of assets. So we're only carrying a 5% debt loading on those assets. So the assets, are very under indebted. So it's perfectly reasonable to put that $8 million on top and to enhance our chance of, getting that back or, having that debt relief later on. Because then that will increase our return, because we've put decades, probably more than other councils throughout New Zealand because we've been here longer, many decades of investment into our Three Waters system. So I can't support option 1, but I can support option 2. So I'd like to foreshadow a motion that should option 1 fail, I will put forward option 2. And, you know, we've got $46 million in coming. So there's no reason why we can't hold some of that second tranche of $38 million back to cover this $8 million of debt. So there's no need for the $8 million to be left stranded, none whatsoever. The government is supplying us enough money to cover the bases, so why take the risk of losing it altogether? We have a chance that it will be taken offshore with debt. And Lord knows we've got plenty of other debt in the council, and there's only 120 in the Three Waters budget, Three Waters bucket, but that could be much greater depending on how money had been ascribed to the buckets in the past. I'm sorry if you don't have buckets per se, but it's a figure of speech that's appropriate in this situation, I feel. And so the more debt relief we can get, the better, because some councillors will have no debt, and what's going to happen with them? So I think we should, as I say, I cannot support option 1, but I will foreshadow option 2 should it fail.
Councillor Vandervis.
I think Councillor Raddick is correct when he says, or he views this particular decision as us getting ready for the new entity. The analogy or the similar process that seems to have happened with Dunedin's loss of its Waipori power generation facility was another government edict where the government apparently indicated that we weren't going to be allowed to both be a generator of electricity and a lines distributor, and therefore we had to sell one. We rushed in at that stage and unwisely and very inappropriately, I believe, sold the Waipori generation facility, which was then very rapidly resold for many millions more to Trustpower. We have a situation where if we'd just dragged the chain back in the Waipori days, we might still own what was the best cash cow earner that the city ever had. Because a number of other councils in the country did drag the chain. They didn't jump when the government said jump. They didn't say how high. They simply stuck with the status quo, stuck with what they valued, and ended up with much better value because of it. I think the analogy here is similar. Obviously, it's another generation on, and obviously it's an even bigger, more expensive entity, a more expensive asset that's at stake here. Councillor Lord has said that one of the reasons for changing things is that some systems, and I think he means by this council treated water systems, were not working. Well, we accept that this was the case in Havelock North. In fact, it wasn't the system that wasn't working, it was the implementation of it, and people should have gone to jail for what happened there. But if you look at the underlying rationale for government's reform proposals, as in 13 of our paper, the rationale that they have advertised has been 34,000 waterborne disease incidents, a figure questionable in itself, but a figure that has been since outed as not relating to council treated water supplies at all. It related to farm supplies and village supplies and private supplies and marae supplies. And when Ms. Huria was here speaking on behalf or as a spokesman for Ngāi Tahu, she emphasised that, you know, one of the reasons driving this was that when she was in this little village, they didn't have decent water. And that might still be the cases around the country. It's not the case for Dunedin. We haven't had events here. There is always risk, but we've managed that risk well. And in terms of being able to manage the risk well, we made, I believe, a far better job of the potential risk that was in Waikawaiti than any centralised government entity could make. Mayor Hawkins has said the status quo is not an option. This is plainly untrue. It's an option on option 3 here, actually. And if we're not to be apologists for central government rapacious takeover of our Three Waters system, then I believe the status quo is probably the wisest option that we can take, where we simply carry on as we have, producing water that the public of Dunedin are happy enough with, and not get ourselves into a lot more debt, not spend another $4 million on 15 extra staff members, and goodness knows where they are going to come from. The, pardon me while I just check. The Maori Advisory Group...
You're about 15 seconds.
Oh, the Maori Advisory Group has had such trouble getting people to work for it that MP Mahuta has had to make her own sister the co-chair of the Maori Advisory Group. We're not going to be able to get those 15 staff because they are only going to be here for a 2-year contract. They would far rather, if they were sensible, go to the bigger, deeper, longer pockets of the government.
That's your 5 minutes, Councillor.
We need the status quo, and we need it desperately.
Thank you. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What could be more central to wellbeing than water? And for those of you who turn a tap on and take it for granted, there are those who don't. And I take issue with Councillor Vandevus's comment around our water supplies. There are communities within our city boundaries who do not have access to safe drinking water, not necessarily it's not on reticulated systems, and so there are people who fall into the category that you described as being elsewhere. What we're considering today...
Point of order.
Point of order, Councillor.
I did not describe them as being elsewhere. I described them as being outside the council-treated system.
So that what? Standing...
Misrepresentation, blatant misrepresentation of what I had said.
I think...
Mr. Chair, happy to withdraw if that was what the councillor meant.
Okay, good.
However, I still make the point that there are communities within the city boundaries who don't have access to safe drinking water. Today, though, we're deciding how to spend this first tranche of money, which is in response to Mara Arawai. And none of us are saying this is around any agreement with Three Waters. We, I believe, generally agree in our opposition to the Three Waters reform and aspects of it. But we all agree, I believe, around the institution of the regulator. And so the question is, are we spending this in the right place or not? And just to take up the point that Councillor Raddick made, I do believe the proposal on option 1 does deliver community wellbeing. And I want to give you an example, because I think sometimes examples help us to understand what this means for our community. And for our community, they want to know that there is going to be benefit from the planning and design work that goes into the Three Waters work and what that actually means for them. So I want to take the example of a couple who've come to our annual plan on numerous occasions, the Szymanskis, who had huge issues in 2015 with flooding and latterly. And it's a public-private stormwater issue that we have plans to do something about, but we don't have the resources to address it. There's a very long list of priorities in this regard. This funding, as I understand it, will allow us to address those public-private stormwater issues for members of our community for whom it has had a major effect. So design work is going to be important, and preparing for what we need to do in the future. Whether Three Waters evolves in the way we think it's going to, and it seems to, or not, we still want to be able to deliver for our community. And we want all the new entity to deliver for our community. So let's remember that this is about community wellbeing, but in a different way. We'll decide later about the balance of the money and how that might be spent, and I'm delighted to hear so many of my colleagues mention the Peninsula Connection in that regard, and the 20 million of unfunded sections. So that's a conversation for another day, but I am glad it's in your mind. So I will certainly be supporting this option because I do believe it delivers community wellbeing in a particular way. And we're going to need those staff to carry out this work. And as reading through your papers, it was very clear to me when I was reading through the papers in detail that there's going to be a lot of bureaucratic process in relation to this, and we are going to need the people to deliver the work. Thank you.
Councillor Houlihan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I have to say I have a concern about the whole paper, because there's just too many questions unanswered, as usual. This whole process has been, quite frankly, a debacle from start to go, and none of it's shown me that it's improved in any way. I mean, perhaps the government showed a little bit of flexibility or what would you call it? I suppose it's a bit of flexibility in the fact that they, have agreed to some of the terms, a lot of the terms that some councils put forward. There was a lot of councils who weren't even involved in that negotiation. So, and now people are saying that the shareholding thing is just not going to work, and the governance structure doesn't seem to be appropriate. There's just so many questions we don't know. If we agree to any of these options, what message are we sending to our residents? Are we saying, if we approve option 1, that pretty much says to our residents, okay, well, we agree with all this, we'll go ahead. But what are we agreeing to? We don't actually even know. We don't know what money we're going to be getting. If we go with status quo, we have budgeted for a lot of this money already in our 10-year budget that we could carry on until we actually have more defined budgets, more terms and conditions, more outlines, and have an idea of what we're actually agreeing to, surely, I assume. And what Councillor Gary said before, someone please correct me if I'm wrong or enlighten me, but I don't know whether she's correct in saying that about, because how is the government going to, I don't believe the government has said that it's going to go in and, connect up all these places that aren't already connected. It's a massive job. It's a huge amount of money, and I don't think they've agreed to that.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Well, clearly Councillor Houlihan is misrepresenting what Councillor Geary said. Councillor Geary was actually just making the point that, contrary to Councillor Vandervis's point that there were people in other places, she made the point that there are people in this very city that don't have access to water, and I'm one of them. I've got tank water and it's not reliable, it's not clean, and we constantly see a number of people come into council that want to get connected up. So that's what Councillor meant. So she's clearly misrepresented what was said.
I think in your point of order, though, as you got towards the end of it, you may have actually come back to what she said, because you started to mention people wanting to become connected to the reticulated system, which actually I don't think is what, I mean, I'm actually going to uphold
Councillor Houlihan said,
because I don't think that's what Councillor Gary said.
Councillor Houlihan said that Councillor Gary had said that they would all get joined up, and there's no promise of that.
I will ask you to just withdraw or clarify that statement, Councillor Houlihan. Councillor Gary did not suggest, from my hearing of it, that everybody was going to be connected to a reticulated system.
What I was asking, I suppose, in my speech was a question, as clarity around that, because when I listened to Councillor Gary and what she said, I didn't believe what she was saying was correct as far as what the government's agreed to do, but if someone can give me evidence...
Can you just move? Because I've ruled the point of order to uphold it, you just kind of got to move past it, so can you carry on? Did you withdraw the comment? You have to. Basically, I'm asking you to withdraw the comment that that you said that Councillor Gary had said that everybody would get connected up to a reticulated system. I need you to withdraw that first, because that's an incorrect statement, because she did not say that, and then you can continue with your speech once you've withdrawn that.
I'd like to see the video back because I believe she was encouraged.
Listen, you don't. I make the determination, that's otherwise would be here forever. The determination's been made by me. I'm upholding Councillor Lord's point of order. My answer to the point of his point of order is that you need to withdraw that statement, because I do not believe she made it, and we're not going to debate it. But if we can't move on soon, I don't really know what I'll have to do. I'll take advice of what we do next. So please withdraw the statement and move on.
Right, okay, I'll withdraw that statement and move on, and my statement was saying that I wasn't sure whether she was saying...
You can't repeat a statement you've withdrawn, Councillor. Please move on.
Yep, moving on, okay. So, I mean, I've completely lost track of what I was saying now, because I've been interrupted so many times, I'm not sure whether I'm answer. But the point I was trying to make before I've been interrupted about 4 times,
Councillor, you need to show respect for the chamber and for the group. A point of order was called and it was ruled on. That's it. That's what happened.
I didn't even hear the point of order being called, so it's very hard to hear by Zoom, but thank you for that. Okay, okay. So what I carry on and say is that I'm not sure how by some miracle the government thinks it is going to change all the drinking water problems, you know, because in Dunedin, and I suppose I would say that we have a fairly good system, you know, like, well, show us the evidence of where our water is absolutely shocking and terrible in Dunedin. I mean, yes, we've had the lake problems, but it was shown that there wasn't lead in the water here. The government tried to, you know, sort of embellish that a bit, but, you know, we have, I would dispute that Dunedin has shocking water system. And I would say that over the years, our infrastructure, yes, we could do with better infrastructure, there's no doubt about that, but I'm just querying and asking, how is the government going to guarantee that they're going to do a way better job than what's already been done? I just don't know how they can. And my next question or statement is, you know, where are we getting these council of emphasis? Where are these staff they're saying they're going to come from? I know for a fact, as we all do, there's a huge shortage, so I don't think that's going to come to fruition straight away. Yeah, I just have so many concerns about this, and so many questions that aren't answered. Once again, I just think it's a debacle.
Thank you, Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the beginning of her speech, Councillor Houlihan talked about we don't even know what this money is going to be used for. I think it was the Chair yourself, you asked a very pertinent question earlier when you asked about the separation between delivery and regulatory, and the fact that there's been nationally very little disagreement on that regulatory framework set now under Tūmata Arawai. So, as you said earlier, I think, and forgive me if I misquote you, this responds to those requirements, and I think that's correct. There's obviously, I mean, there's a lot of discussion around debt, and there's clearly a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to our debt if and when Entity 4 is set up and our debt, whatever that amount is subsumed into that. But and there are risks there. But I certainly don't support in any way. In fact, the risks are actually supporting option 3. That's why I discard that straight off. But but I certainly don't want to get into guessing games along the lines of Councillor Radich, who quite, confidently in his speech, and that's his choice, who said, oh, it'll probably be about 50-50. Well, good luck working that out. I mean, your comments earlier to me, which were extremely below the belt and disrespectful, when I came up with various numbers, you said I had an into government, and I firmly reject that, and you give me far too much credit, sir, if you believe that Minister Mahuta has a hotline to Port Chalmers. So,
point of order.
Oh,
my goodness.
Yeah, point of order.
Goodness. You're misrepresenting what I said, and as you said, I've given you credit. I asked you a simple question: is that a government insight? It's certainly not a disrespectful. So you're conflating the two and misrepresenting what I said.
What point of order? What standing order are you calling the point of order on?
Misrepresentation.
I think in the spirit of debate, a misrepresentation is a deliberate opposition of what the person has said.
Chair, I'm happy to withdraw just to move the debate on.
For the purpose of moving on, thank you.
Yeah. So on page 39, I think and the reason I'm going to support option 1 is the advantages there are clearly stated. I think all those advantages are pertinent, but I don't think we should overlook the second and the third one. So the second one being, with well-considered investment plans, there will be improved probability that Dunedin's 3 water infrastructure is funded and delivered by the new entity. And I think that's very important to bear that in mind. And also, as I've alluded to, the improvements to performance monitoring, reporting, the frameworks under the stuff I've mentioned, are requirements under Te Mata Arawai. And actually, I don't think we should also overlook the ability to better attract what is going to be a constrained market, the skills and knowledge that we will need along with other councils. And also the mayor pointed out in his opening that option 1 does support housing development and growth, and also supports many of other strategic criteria. So, I mean, that to me only leaves us with option 1. So option 2 isn't and shouldn't be put forward as a tenable option for us. Thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
For trying to put this paper together, and I use the words trying to put this paper together, but in saying that, you know what, they've really put a paper together based on so many assumptions and unknowns, and trying to give us something that's actually quite clear to read. Especially when I went back over the paper from 2020 and tried to work out where the government was heading then, and then to see where they're heading now, and to see the paper we have in front of us. To be honest, if there's any murky water in our country right now, it's coming from the government in this aspect, and all the misinformation and also commentary and thoughts, and I don't know, it seems to be whims that they want to pull out at any time. It just seems so inconsistent. If they actually gave us some clear guidelines on what was taking place, then I think there would be ability for all councils, all 67 councils, to basically get on board. But we just listen to the debate around our table on trying to put a recommendation forward and multiply that by all the councils around the country. Yeah, talk about wasting local government time if government could actually get this right in the first place. That's my biggest frustration right now. The second part is, yeah, they keep teasing us with pots of money here and there and then trying to put requirements around it. And as much as I hate to say it, you know what, we might as well take these pots of money or sweeteners or whatever you want to call them and actually use it for the betterment of the city. And so I will support this option, and I will because I support what the Mayor said. When I look at 34B, delivery of infrastructure and services that enable housing development to grow. So anything that can actually assist us get that work done ASAP to build more houses in this city, I think is a good thing. But I think there's a big failure, not from us around the table, not from our council, not from our council staff, but from the government. And I think that is the biggest tragedy here, is that we go round and round in circles trying to get some clear pathway on what this program is going to look like, how it's going to work for the city, how it's going to work best for the ratepayers. But in the meantime, you know, we have to actually work with what the information we have in our papers, and so I will support it, but God, this is frustrating. Thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair, and I too will reflect initially on the Three Waters process, and right from the start I have had concerns about the process that the central government has done in relating to the engagement with local councils and communities around Three Waters. The engagement and consultation process was predetermined. There wasn't the opportunity to look at other options, and still we have a lack of clarity around. We can say, we ask questions of our staff and they can say, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. So there's a lot of work to be done on this space, and I have always expressed my concerns about the process. But this question is about an opportunity, and we're being given an opportunity to be able to fund, through the Better Off funding, a piece of work that we need to do anyway. We need to grow our city. We need more housing. So the hospital rebuild, Kiwi Rail, we are growing as a city. And so I look at the Three Waters Strategic Work Programme, work stream summary, and I go, well, I have to say yes to investment planning for growth planning and growth policy. I have to say yes to pretty much all of these things, and close to my heart is the South Dunedin flood alleviation plan, and I want to see shovels in the ground not too far away, and that says this will be boosted, and we will be able to see some clear plans within a shorter time framework. So I believe, in fact, these are wellbeing, community wellbeing outcomes that we desperately need. And so I'm quite happy to take up option one, the opportunity of getting funding to progress these pieces of work which need to be done anyway in a faster and more efficient way. So I'm very happy to support option one, but I do express my concerns about the process that the government has engaged with local government around Three Waters.
Thank you. Councillor Staines.
Thank you, Chair. I support the resolutions that are before us. I would disagree that using a portion of the Better Off funding as proposed in the motions does not result in an increase in wellbeing. It does. Any investment and necessary work required in the Three Waters area brings an increase in the potential wellbeing of our residents. I agree with the comments made by Councillor Lord that the government's handling of the Three Waters reform has been far from ideal, and it has in fact made it a lot harder for councils to engage well with their communities so that they understand the issues before us and therefore understand why some changes are required. By using some of the Better Off funding to address work needed to meet the new water standards, standards that are designed to keep our residents safe and are highly unlikely to be rescinded by any future government. This is a safety issue. To me, seems logical. Using debt will potentially add it further to our projected rate increases that we will have to add to service that debt. When many of our residents are under financial pressure following the COVID issues, there is still plenty of opportunity for us to consider other wellbeing projects from the second tranche of government funding of some $34.5 million. And I'm sure that as we get towards that point, we will find suitable projects to enhance our city.
Thank you, Councillor Staines. My take on this particular item is that we are effectively responding to phase 1 of Three Waters reform, which is the regulator, and we are also preemptively moving towards understanding our asset management program and our growth strategy so that we're funding that correctly. $4.4 million of extra operating costs, we were told by Mr Logie, sits on top of $350 million of additional operating costs. And I asked the question, does that mean that we are more or less meeting the regulator's demand? One thing I will point out before I get into the actual item is that we have been told over and over and over again that councils will have trouble meeting the new standards. And around about a 1.5% increase in operating costs will allow us to meet the operating expenditures associated with the new standards. So again, I ask, where is the crisis? The debt transfer still remains unclear, so I can see why the staff have recommended 1 versus 2. It's very important to go through the question period because I was not sure whether I wanted 1 or 2 till the questions were asked. If going for option 1 does not mean that we are committed to the 4 water entities, then I don't see any risk of going there. And in terms of Councillor Radish's commentary, if it's money that comes in a form of a grant that allows us then not to take on debt, then the debt we didn't take on can then be used for spending later, which is the same as taking on debt and using that money later. It's a zero-sum game, however you do it. So it adds up to zero one way or the other. I don't really like the term better off because I don't feel better off. I have a feeling that is in fact a mechanism for trying to dissuade away from what is happening. And status quo is not an option. That's obvious. In fact, I don't think anybody is arguing that status quo is an option, but it's often used. Well, Councillor Vandervis is using it. Okay, 14.1. That everybody agrees, and the fact of the matter is that was the formation of Te Mata Arawai. That was the point. That is status quo is not an option, and that is already in place. And no council stood up and said, I don't want that. It's the second component, and it's not this item, I know, but it is in fact the major part of the debate. And we need to keep our eyes on that. I don't believe the 35,000 people a year. 5,500 people were poisoned in Havelock North. And that created a whole foundational change of how we deliver drinking water. Well, if 35,000 are being poisoned every year, Havelock North is happening 6 times a year. I think we would have noticed it, right? And I think, the fact of the matter is that number did come from non-reticulated systems. So again, the government is doing something which I think is disingenuous by quoting that number all the time. The other number I saw on the TV news the other day was 20% of our water is lost during the distribution system. You'll see in the activity reports for Three Waters that is the GIA standard. You cannot stop 20% of your water leaking in a fantastic system. It's accepted. But the government puts it up as, oh my God, another thing we have to worry about. So I am really concerned about the government's narrative and the shoving us down this program. And I want to clarify again, there are 2 phases to Three Waters reform. Phase 1 is over. We have the new regulator. And with that is meeting Te Mana o Te Wai and the other things that go with partnership, and parts of the partnership model are already in place. Phase 2 is the economic model. And I have serious issues with the economics of the economic model, but it is not today's item, so I will stop there at that point. Today's item is really comparing between, do we take the debt or do we go after the grant? Because we are definitely going to fund it and therefore go after the grant, especially if it doesn't come with fishhooks. And if we don't get it because it's factually well-being based and won't get it, then staff will have to come back to us with an alternative. Thank you. Reply.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you're quite right that the reform program is a game of 2 halves, and one of them is about shifting the regulatory environment, and that has broad public and political support, and the other is around water service delivery and which is the more contentious. And it's frustrating but inevitable that those two things would be conflated in the way that we've seen here. I do want to pick up on the comment you made, Mr. Chairman, around whether this budget would allow us to meet the standards. My recollection of the Chief Executive's comments was that it would give us the best chance of meeting the regulatory standards, and that's a subtle but critical distinction. And when you look at, as Councillor Elder has outlined, all of the things that we are being asked to resource by supporting this, it's hard to argue against any of them. And so this is absolutely work that has to happen on a number of fronts. I mean, I've said, and Mr. Chairman, you've said that the status quo isn't an option. We've heard from one of our colleagues that it's the only option, and that we should drag the chain and wait for a change of regulatory environment. And I think that's a fantasy. There is a fourth option, obviously, between not doing the work, debt funding the work, or accepting the grant, I suppose, and that we could fund all of it through our annual operating budgets and watch our rates bill go through the ceiling, because we don't have an option but to respond to the regulatory standards that have been set and that we largely agree with. And so that would be the only conceivable alternative. And we've been asked by Councillor Houlihan, what message do we send if we accept any of these three options? I think the message we send is that we are all taking the necessary upgrades to our water system seriously, and that we know that we need to provide a greater. We know we need to provide a three waters network that delivers on the broader wellbeing outcomes that we are committed to, regardless of where the discussion may land around the water service entities and how that might work. And just lastly, we are often reminded by Councillor Raddick and others about the perils of our debt limit, and I find it remarkable that we're then being encouraged to borrow money to do this operating work. And one of the accusations that is levelled at local government often is that the below ground infrastructure work gets ignored because nobody can see it, and councils are more interested in funding projects that people can see and benefit from. And that is exactly the conversation that we've been having at this meeting, that we should be using it to build shared paths and other community assets, and not worry about prioritising investment in our core infrastructure. And I think that would be negligent of us to not take the opportunity we have now to do the work that we know needs to be done and have government fund it for us. And I welcome the support of colleagues for that course of action today. Thanks.
Very good. I'll put it by division.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
Aye.
Councillor Elder. Aye. Councillor Gary. Aye. Mayor Hawkins.
Aye.
Councillor Houlihan. Councillor Houlihan.
Oh, I couldn't get rid of you.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Councillor Fiso.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Ms MacDonald.
Aye.
Ms Poteke. Aye. Councillor Raddick.
No.
Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Walker.
Aye.
Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Motion carried 13-2.
Very good. We do not have item 9 because we've adjusted, so we're heading on to item 10, naming of a private way, which is on page 170. Who's coming up for that? Ms. Benson? Generally speaking, you don't have to stay here very long. Any questions? Councillor Gary.
Find my page first. I'm presuming this is naming of the private way. Yeah. So the question is an associated question, but does relate to this suggestion. what progress are we making, Ms Benson? I know you know what I'm going to ask, around addressing the imbalance of options, diversity-wise, be it gender or other diversity considerations.
Happy to say that we are making good progress. So the team have been collecting a whole bunch of names with more diversity elements in them, and they're putting them through the process now, and we should be in a position that we can report back on some new names for the register in the July ASCOM.
Thank you. And it occurred to me that I don't know, but I would imagine that most of the developers, many of the developers are male, and they're also choosing from a list of mostly male names. But that could continue, couldn't it, even if there is a balance?
But I think having more available will probably help.
Hopefully. Thank you so much.
Any more questions? Do I have Councillor Lord, option 1, I assume. Seconded by Councillor Radich. All those in favour? Against? Carried. We're moving on because we're going to go into lunch with this meeting, so we'll have lunch between the two meetings. So we are now on to the activity reports, of which the first, I believe, is reserves and recreational facilities. Do you wish to speak to it at all? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to take questions.
Questions, Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have problems with some of these questions, and I know that we are reviewing them, but can you tell me, on page 191, percentage of users satisfied with cemeteries? Satisfied in what way? I mean, I don't wish to be flippant, but I really struggle with those kind of questions, and I'm sure it does have some meaning, but can you assist me?
Through the chair, that's a difficult one. That came up at the last activity report. The anecdotal feedback we receive throughout the year from people visiting cemeteries for a range of reasons is usually fairly positive, so I can't provide any specific detail on the outcome of the survey.
Could it be related to the upkeep, maintenance of, and how people, I see this Chief Executive nodding her head, so that would be my assumption. I'd probably answer my own question. Thank you, Mr. McLean.
Councillor Elder.
Hi, Mr. McLean. Good to see you. Our parks and reserves are very important. My first question is just around COVID has affected our swimming facilities in particular. And I was wondering, is there going to be any campaign or any advertising to get our people back into those pools? I mean, it is winter time, but looking at, say, Moana Pool, etc.
Through the chair, we have no specific advertising campaigns. We do get contacted frequently by members of the public just asking what the situation is with our aquatic facilities, so there's a high level of interest out there anyway. So.
Thank you. And the other thing is there is some work being done in the pool space, is there not? An assessment of our aquatic services?
Through the chair, yes, we've got an aquatic provision review underway, so that looks at all of council-owned facilities, but also either community-owned or school-owned facilities, just to look at their usage and how we might work together better with the providers of those aquatic facilities.
A question, and that is the disability community and people who are doing rehab for injuries, etc., have used the physio pool. Is there a growing request for kind of rehabilitation or the ability for the disability community to use other pools?
Thank you, and through the Chair, we work closely with our disability groups, so that's accessibility for all of our facilities is front of mind, and the new aquatic facility being constructed out at Moskill has provision for some hydrotherapy as well.
Oh, cool, thank you for that. And thanks for all the work you do. And the other last question was the contracts around sports grounds and sports grounds maintenance, and we changed the contract in that space. What is the feedback on the performance of that contract and maintenance of sports grounds?
Thanks through the Chair. Certainly the feedback from our summer sports codes, which is recently wound up, has been really positive.
Oh, thank you.
Councillor Lord.
Thank you, Chair. Look, this is probably actually a question for Simon, but I just noticed with the water main breaks year to date, and I realise we've still got 3 months to go, but it looks like we're going to finish probably under last.
Ahead of yourself there.
Oh, sorry.
I know it's all one item, but it's broken into subparts, okay. So there'll be part D. Mr. McLean could have a go, but I think not. Councillor Houlihan.
Did you say that?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, it's very hard to hear. It sounds like you're talking on the computer. Thank you. I just have a question around this. Given the results are pretty poor on everything, have we ever had results like this before? Where we haven't met almost all of these. It was some we're meeting, but not many. How common is that?
Just before Mr. McLean answers, this is broken into 5 parts. So is this in part A, the Parks and Rec, you're noticing the poor performance, or in other parts?
Overall.
I don't know if he can answer overall. Maybe Mr. Drew should answer overall.
I guess overall the reports show previous years against this current financial year, so you can read into that how you like.
Your Worship. No. I was just already looking in that direction, sorry.
And sorry, if I can just clarify that, as you know, we are reporting more directly on our performance against some of our levels of service and our measures. And and we're doing a review because some of the measures, the cemetery ones are a really good example, are really difficult to know how people are answering the question, satisfaction with cemeteries, what does that mean? And so we think it's important that we have measures that are meaningful, that help staff do the business. And at the minute, we don't have that. And so at the same time, we've had 2 years of COVID, and all services and responses to local government across the country, and if Councillor Barker were here, she has done a lot of work on looking at this, have shown decreases across the board with councils, with government, with everything. It's a function of where we find ourselves in the political cycle and just with in the community at the minute.
Thank you. Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a general question of the report, if you'll indulge me, and it's where, just as it relates to where we have figures that are graphed relative to previous years, and I wonder, just because some things track on different trajectories at different times of the year, whether it would be difficult to provide year-to-date figures from the previous year as well as the full year figures from the previous year, just to be able to compare where we are at now. Sorry, I don't know who this is a question for. Where we're at now with where we were, or it could be valid reasons not to do that.
So you're talking trends essentially, so comparing May year on year, for example, or
yeah, or just to be because it.
Well, there'll be cycles depending on where you are in a season potentially. Yeah. I don't know if it's possible, but again, these are relatively new formats and iterative, and as we do that work, I think it's useful to look at how we actually express the numbers, but I can't answer whether it's possible or not.
Yeah, thanks. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question's been partially answered, but I want to make sure I'm really clear about it. So, would it be fair to say, Ms. Graham, that these results are partially impacted by some questions that have dubious meaning? I mean, they're just sort of, it's a little unclear, and I know that's part of a review. So it's, you know, what is the question we're asking, and then, but the overriding issue is not poor performance, but the impact of COVID. Is that a fair enough comment?
I don't think it's as black and white as that, but I think the results need to be read in light of a COVID environment. But also, I'm not sure that the questions that we ask are necessarily dubious. I think rather we need to make...
wrong word.
Yeah, but I think, well, because I think it's always really important to get the opinion of your residents. I think it's just probably more helpful for them and for us to ask questions that then help us ensure that we're delivering really good service.
Meaningful questions,
yeah.
Meaningful questions, yes. I just was concerned that left hanging was this idea that was overall poor performance, when in fact there are other factors here.
But the results are challenging though in some areas, and when you look at the questions that we ask and the results that we get, like, we are doing our best, and that's why we're not sure that we're necessarily asking the right questions.
Thank you.
I actually have a Reserves and Recs question directly. It's the FIFA Women's World Cup and the floodlights. There's a lot of floodlights going up, and Caledonia and Logan Park are getting more sets there by this. Is there, firstly, you'll be able to just go there all day and apparently play now. So the question is, when it's all over, is there a plan on keeping those floodlights up, or is there a plan on distributing through the city to other recreational areas?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The plan will be to keep the lights up. It's a pretty big investment, but it does enable a much higher light level. So, yeah, definitely a really good training environment. But we have had, over the last couple of years, quite an extensive light training pole program. We were going and either putting in new or replacing ones that are end of life. Yeah.
Okay, so you've talked to Football South about how that will be used afterwards in terms of other football clubs?
Through the chair, yep. We've been in some discussion with some clubs as well about where the lights are going, and will that open up the likes of Tahuna Park, for example, for training.
Yeah, I said Tahuna and then the Caledonia and Logan Park 6. Thank you. Councillor Houlihan and then Councillor Wiley.
Sorry, no, my hand was just up from before.
Oh, very enthusiastic. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. My question is actually for Ms. Graham. I'm just trying to get my head around how the company does the surveying and that type of thing, because I was surprised. I've been sent 2 invitations to be surveyed, and I've not replied or responded in any way. So I find it ironic that the names of, for example, councillors and even council staff could be on the list and could be responding. So, did you aware of that?
Well, I received one last year, but I did respond. But I guess I can follow up on the methodology, but I'm not aware of how they select, but I imagine that all ratepayers are eligible and all ratepayers' opinion have a value, and I would be very loath to suggest that the council staff didn't have an opportunity to comment in their ratepayer capacity.
Okay, well, my wife sort of indicated that's what she would like to do, and I said no, it's said to me, so, and I wouldn't have her do it either, so.
Was it to your address or to you? Any more questions to this section of the item? Thank you, Mr. McLean. Next one is waste management and Mr. Henderson. I think, Sia, you should just sit there because some of these could be general. I'll ask the perfunctory question. Do you want to speak to this or just take questions?
Happy to take it as read. Take questions.
Questions, Councillor Van der Vis.
Looking at page 194, the amount of municipal solid waste per person in kilograms, a very heavily descending graph, continuing to go way below the expectation. Is that a result largely of Nash and Ross's successful landfill, or are there other reasons for it?
Couldn't give you an exact idea of exactly what the reasons are. All we can do is measure what we're receiving. So I can't tell you whether that is actually a result of the efforts to reduce waste or whether that waste is going somewhere else. I can't actually definitively tell you that.
Can I ask a question, if I might, through the chair?
Welcome, yes.
Is the Nash and Ross landfill able to take municipal waste?
Oh, sorry, just to be clear, no, Nash and Ross landfill cannot take municipal waste. It's not a Class 1 landfill.
Can you define then for me what municipal solid waste actually is then?
So municipal solid waste is basically anything collected from normal household wastes, a lot of commercial activities. So it includes pretty much everything. So food waste, green waste, medical waste, all that kind of stuff is included in that overall definition of municipal solid waste.
But it's not commercial solid waste?
Some of it is. Obviously, we collect waste from the central business district in town, so we do actually collect waste from commercial activities on George Street, South Dunedin, Mosgiel, etc.
Is it not the case that Nash and Ross's landfill has been, since 2017 when it got its consents, progressively been the place where an increasing amount of waste has been deposited?
Certain types of waste, yes, not municipal solid waste.
Okay, what types of waste
primarily
been getting then?
Primarily Nash and Ross is a construction and demolition landfill, so primarily it can take some special waste like asbestos, and construction demolition material is the primary waste for that landfill.
Does it also take solid clay and excavation waste?
It would be using that, yeah, obviously for likes of cover material, etc., yes.
Right. So to answer my initial question, you really don't know why we have this very rapid and significant decline in the solid waste from municipal solid waste?
I can't give you a definitive answer to it because we don't monitor what's going where, and we don't have that ability to do so.
Thank you.
Can I just follow that up though before Councillor Radish? If Waste Management picks their red bins up and then takes them to Green Island, are you capturing that?
Yes, anything that goes to Green Island landfill we're capturing, yes, as part of our reporting.
So therefore, forget the year to date this year, but last year at 401 kilos per person, that's the total year. It's genuinely down from 670, like effectively either they're fly tipping it or taking it out of town then, is that correct?
Well, we're not seeing an increase in fly tipping, so yeah.
Well, I mean, it'd be a lot to fly tip. So what I'm getting at is you can capture every piece of municipal waste picked up by both the council and private contractors, provided they take it through the Green Island landfill weighbridge.
That's correct. If it's going to Green Island landfill, we have it reported in our figures, yes. Okay.
Because I had misinterpreted this figure as black bags, DCC bags.
No, it's more than that. It's basically, it includes drop-off or whatever goes to the transfer station at Green Island.
Thank you. Councillor Radish.
So firstly, further to to previous questions, what about the red bins that we see on the roadside picked up by a private contractor? Do they go to Green Island or to Nash and Ross?
If it's a red bin on the side of the road for a household, it can't go to Nash and Ross. it's either coming to Green Island or going to another Class 1 facility.
Right, so it could be going to Abbey Lime or somewhere else. Yeah,
Actually,
very good. On the graph, page 195, which is municipal solid waste disposed to landfill, is dropping. Disposed to, yeah. What about, general commercial waste and industrial waste? So you're saying industrial demolition waste is going to Nash and Ross. Commercial waste, is there other types of stuff going to Nash and Ross or not?
As I mentioned before, sorry, Councillor, I don't actually know exactly what's going in there, but because they cannot take the organic waste, the food waste, medical waste, that kind of stuff, there's still an amount of industrial waste or commercial waste, construction demolition that could be going there.
Yes, but they can't take organic food waste, because I know they are taking green waste, like clippings or tree branches and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I believe that Nash and Ross purchased the cheapest green waste facility that was in Corrica Valley. I believe that is now owned by Nash and Ross. So they're taking garden waste, yes.
Garden waste, yep. Very good. And page 196, the amount of diversion. We are increasing very slowly. How does our rate of 13% compare to the other main, metros through New Zealand that we're typically compared with?
I can't give you an accurate figure. However, it depends very much on what diversion you have in place. Obviously, at the moment, we don't have construction or demolition diversion at Green Island, and we don't have a food waste collection service, which is, that kind of thing is available in Christchurch, Tauranga, Hamilton. So they would have a much higher diversion rate than we do, but I can't tell you exactly what that is.
And that is why Council has added into the 10-year plan a series of new initiatives to increase our diversion options. And so that's some deliberate funding that this council has agreed to further our waste minimisation objectives.
Great. Thank you.
Councillor Garrett.
Oh, thank you. This is following up on His Worship's question, and it's related to page 194 in the graph there. On that particular trajectory for year to date, what do you anticipate? What's your sense of how the year will end? Do you have any sense of that, Mr. Henderson?
It looks like we're actually going to do quite well on that figure. We're coming into winter, which is obviously the normally a quieter time for landfill disposal. So I would anticipate we will be lower than the 2021 figure again. Yep.
Thank you.
When you mentioned winter, it just made me think, so this does not differentiate from green waste?
Green Island Landfill, we do divert green waste. We have the green waste mulching out there, so that is not going to landfill, the green waste. As long as it's dropped off.
So the graph 2 on page 194, amount of municipal solid waste per person is not, green waste is not contributing to that?
As long as that green waste goes to that diversion, it's not included at what goes over into the landfill itself.
So you just mentioned winter. What's the seasonal variance from household waste?
Normally, it's more the that commercial activity. There's a lot less construction and demolition activity over the winter months.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Thank you. More questions? I think that's you've been released. Property is next. Very good. Any questions of property? Thank you, Ms. Nielsen. Do you want to say anything to your report or just take questions? Very good. Questions? Could be very quick. I I had asked a while back, like 2 meetings ago, about what we knew our standing energy plants were, and I noticed we've got data on the amount of energy we're using. Is there any reason if we're paying that bill, we can't figure out what building it's going to?
Yes, 2 points to your answer. We're just waiting on some more information on one more department at the moment, and then we'll have that. And the reason why we can't tell all units by their energy bill is that some of the units aren't in use. They're generators, they're holding diesel in case it's needed, but if the generators aren't using it, then it doesn't come through to that bill.
And that, so that's not okay, so do we have a way of separating occupied buildings from facilities that are used to perform other functions?
No, it's not that though, it's backup generators. So the building can be occupied and running normally, and then we have a backup generator on site.
Okay, thanks. And Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a housekeeping question in respect of the surrounds of this building. Can I assume that the green mould, unsightly and probably unsafe ultimately green mould that's featuring in the octagon outside the southern steps of this building will be picked up and cleaned and by the normal maintenance regime around this building?
I think your question will be better answered in our workshop later this afternoon when we talk about the municipal chambers and town hall exterior works. That's when we'll be able to deal with some of those matters.
Look forward to it.
Councillor Elder.
Electricity, LPG and diesel purchases and gigawatts. These have been reducing. Is there a correlated economic impact of that? Like, are we making savings across our energy?
Yeah, the price of electricity has gone up, so I couldn't give you those figures.
Okay, yeah. No, I was just wondering, that was all.
For want of not sounding too much like a broken record, but obviously the last one is year to date, so it's obviously not. Is there any way when we do that kind of year to date that we could have a line across the other ones that's the same time in that year? Otherwise it's kind of...
I know, and that's the question His Worship asked earlier, and I can't commit to being able to do it depending on how the data is collected, but we'll certainly have a look at it as part of that review of how we report on these things.
Yeah, I did acknowledge the broken record. Any more questions? Okay, then we're on to Three Waters. Thank you very much, Mrs. I think Mr. Drew is actually doing this. You want to speak to it too, apparently.
I'd just like to highlight an error to councillors and to show that in some occasions we do the year-to-date data, and so graph 10 on page 216 is one of those graphs. And just to highlight the error, that year-to-date data from previous years is only up to December, not 31st of March. There's an error in all the previous years, and so when we've actually added in the data from December to March, it's then equivalent with the years that you see that with this year's data. So does that make sense? Try again. Graph 10, we have mapped so we can compare this financial year, year to date, against previous financial years. We've made an error in this graph. Previous financial years, the data is only to 31st of December, not the 31st of March. So there is some data missing from those bars.
May I ask a question through the chair? It's slightly irregular.
You may.
Do you have an updated graph you could circulate, Simon?
We do.
Marvellous, that would be helpful.
But we won't be moving that onto finance and CCO. So. I've actually got a couple waiting. Councillor Wiley, then Van der Wisten. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, and Mr. Drew, thank you for that clarification, because I noted, for example, on graph 20, we were looking at our faults at around 46. So that was 46 for 6 months, but yet all of a sudden we ended up at 110 in the 2020-21 year. And I also then looked at odour, and we looked at 2 issues on graph 10 in the 2021 year. And then we end up, and understand that 6 months, we end up at 31. So I'm just wondering how we get such a big jump, even though the graphs are, for 6 months for the year to date as such, and yet we end up with 31 and numbers like that. Is it? Yeah. Look forward to your response.
Yeah, correct. So largely it's because we're comparing 6 months of data against 9, but we do see an increase in faults and bursts in summers, particularly dry summers. So it's not uncommon.
So, okay, but I understand, I had a feeling it was weather related to a point with the faults and the blockages. I'm looking also at the odour, and after my experience of being at Chisholm Park for a number of years, knowing the odour effect and how bad it was at times, I then look at how we go from, on graph 10 we've got 2 for the 2021 year for the 6 months, that's July 1 through to December 31st, 2020. And then we end up at 31 on graph 9.
12, do you
That's
mean?
29 in 6 months.
I think you mean 12 in the 9 months to financial year to date?
I'm looking at the yellow bar, but yeah, and even the green bar I can totally understand it, except because we still don't know. Based on the graph history, I would expect we'll probably end up at least 30, looking at the previous.
Could I ask a question? Does time of year play a part in odour? The warmer it gets, the more likely it is that there are odour issues?
Yeah, that's correct. And last financial year, my recollection is the majority of those odour complaints were around a particular pump station in Brighton, where we had some failures. And so there are a number of complaints relating to the same piece of infrastructure, which is why we have that wee spike.
Okay, can I also ask, is council still doing regular monitoring with the odour and reporting it accordingly?
Yes, we have a number of consent conditions that require us to odour for monitoring, and we do that.
Sorry, can you repeat that? There was a rumbling in the background.
Yes, we have a number of resource consent conditions that require us to monitor for odour, and Tahuna Wastewater Treatment Plant is one of those. We were monitoring odour at the boundary.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Councillor Van der Vis.
We look at graph number 4, which is on page 209. Number of complaints about drinking water seems to have dropped quite significantly. Is this one of the graphs that needs to be tweaked, or is this one okay?
No, the data on this one is correct, but on this occasion you're seeing 12 months worth of data from the previous years against 9 months of data for this financial year.
So the lower green bar on the graph will actually end up higher.
Correct. So at end of year, this graph will be showing apples for apples across the year.
And the number of complaints about drinking water on that graph, if we go over the page, we've got year-to-date complaints about drinking water. Is that actually complaints, or should that be consumption?
No, this is one of the graphs where we've tried to compare apples with apples. So you've now got 9 months worth of data from previous years compared against.
All right, so the same problem would exist between graphs 9 and 10, page 215 and 216.
Correct.
Okay, thanks for that.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My question related to the year-to-date 278 for water mains on graph 6. And I'm just wondering, it looks to me like we are in a downward trend, and is this a reflection of our increased capital spend and renewal of water mains over the last few years, that we're starting to get ahead of the play, and that in the future we should expect that to drop further?
You're correct, Councillor. In general, we're seeing a decreasing trend in our water main bursts. This is another graph where you're comparing 12 months of data against 9.
You know, I was anticipating the increase on the 278. I realise that's 9 months, but we don't see back prior to 2018. So is there an expectation that if we saw a graph over a 10-year period, we would see some significant decrease?
Significant, that's correct.
So it is making a good...
Yep.
Yep, thank you.
To follow up on Councillor Lord's question, I remember asking this question around about 2 years ago, and it was that there wasn't dramatic changes in the number of breaks, but there was a huge change, and I don't see it here in this data set, in the amount of outage time.
Yeah, that's correct as well.
Thank you. Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 2 questions. When it relates to blockages, does that represent a downward trend as well? Because there had been information given to the public about wet wipes and other things that block drains.
Yes, there is. Well, the data is difficult to cut. So at the moment, we are also measuring complaints that are rung in by a member of the public, but the problem ends up on their property and not to the DCC's network.
Oh, okay.
So it's just a complaint that's been logged, but it's not related to our network. So at the moment, the data is quite hard to cut because it's a mixture of problems related to our network and private networks.
Yes, so it could be on before the street, for example. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, the other question is just related to page 211, item 8, future works to begin over the next 12 months. And I'm really pleased to see investigation work at the Glen and Mornington Queue in St Clair. Is that to do with the work related to South Dunedin?
There's overlaps with the South Dunedin project, but it's renewing ageing infrastructure, but doing it alongside the team they're looking at the flood alleviation project.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Councillor Radich.
Yes, in terms of improved performance over time, I'm looking at page 208, graph number 3. The call-out response times show quite a steady decrease for resolution time. Is that due to greater efficiency of Contractor, or why is that?
A number of reasons. Yes, our Contractor has been with us for a number of years and understands and has really good systems in place for when an issue is raised. The network we are renewing over time, so things are easier to fix. So there's a number of reasons that make up those declining response times.
So what is the difference between resolution time and attendance time on this graph? I mean, obviously, attendance time is very similar year on year, but the resolution time is steadily decreasing.
Yeah, so there's a requirement to report from when a fault is first logged, how long it takes to get a crew to the site. And then there's also a requirement to log how long it takes to resolve the problem.
Great. Is that resulting in a net decrease in cost to council, which sounds like to me?
Well, yeah, it's too difficult to say. There are declining costs and increasing costs. Without having a really close look at the data, I couldn't say what we contribute that to.
Yep. Thank you.
I think this was the data set that I was alluding to, which says that it was the policy of Three Waters to go after the biggest at-risk components in the renewals phase, and therefore when you did have a break, the big breaks now weren't happening as often, and therefore they were smaller breaks, therefore they would have been resolved faster, so it was showing up here in the resolution curve. Is that correct?
Yeah, that'd be correct.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just further to that comment you made, Mr. Drew, about the private and public, where blockage is. I just can't find the figure, but am I correct in recalling that it was half of the complaints in regards to that were actually on private land? Do I have that correct?
You're correct.
I just couldn't quite find it.
My recollection of 112, 58 were on private property.
Thank you. Page 211 is a comment in paragraph 7 around e-texting being trialled in a particular situation. I just wanted to know what the potential was for using that further afield in infrastructure projects. And I see here traditional methods are being used as well, but what was the potential for that? It's quite exciting.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the challenges with infrastructure is making and disruption caused by breaks in infrastructure or new infrastructure being thing is making sure that everybody that's impacted understands. So it's still quite early days. We're only just trialling it at the moment, but if there is success, it's an easy way to push out messaging from the team when there are changes to schedules, but it requires people wanting to sign up to the text system.
I'll be interested to see how that goes. Thank you.
Very good. Any more questions? I have one because it's going to be in my speech, really. I notice you've got a lot of DIA endpoints here, and we seem to be meeting them, generally speaking. And what I noticed in my extensive reading in the background for the early item was the Auditor General's report on the stormwater system in Dunedin, I think from 4 years ago. And part of it in the report said that the reporting tended to be a lot, all the councils that were through, it's Porirua, Thames and Dunedin were looked at. All the councils were reporting residents' opinion surveys, but they weren't reporting on the network to the same extent. And I noticed that there's a lot more network reporting in the three waters now. So is that in response to that particular observation, and you want to comment on that?
Yeah, correct. And so some of it's DIA requirements and some of it is to do just that, report on the network so councillors can see how the network's performing.
That's good, thank you very much. Okay, transport, if there's no more questions. Transport, Ms. Benson. Just assume you'll take questions. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Ms. Benson. I note the comment about footpath renewals, and basically we're upping our spend on that. Do you believe this will address the issues such as the issue in the newspaper just recently, a woman who in Mosgiel on her wheelchair came to grief and concerns about that? Obviously it requires also, the public phoning it in, but do you think our program is going to address a lot of those issues?
I think it'll go away towards it, Councillor Gary. I think that combined with the fact that we actually look at accessibility every time we look at the footpath, will go away to addressing those.
Excellent, that's really, really good to hear. And on page 225, paragraph 9, which has some data about the counts of cyclists, would it be fair to say that now the provision is there for people to be able to cycle safely in those areas, people are using it, the uptake's high?
I think that would be fair to say. We measure during the week and at weekend, so we're seeing sort of increases in recreational use at the weekend as well. And we are putting more cycle counters around the shared path network so that we can get more data.
Thank you.
Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try and sneak this question in via graph 1 and 2, and it emanates from me sliding my way along Anzac Avenue this morning on my bike. At this time of the year, when the leaves are falling beautifully off the trees, do we have increased clearage of the roading network of leaves? Because it's a serious question, actually, because we need it if we don't.
Absolutely. Of the roading network, yes. I would have to check on the cycling network, but I would assume so, because it's very normal to increase your maintenance activities when leaves are falling because of the risk.
We have increased maintenance and crews out with leaves, but the leaf drop in the wind, you do it one day, the next day it's there, so.
Yeah, I guess follow-up question is, presumably, as is the case on Anzac at the moment, a lot of those leaves that fall are wet, then get crushed, create a slippery surface that may not actually get cleared.
Well, it poured last night, so the teams were out in advance over the weekend because we knew there was a forecast of rain, so we had crews out. But the leaves fall, it rained last night, it's slippery this morning.
I'm not blaming the leaves. I'm encouraged by the answer.
Councillor Radich.
While we're on specific questions about specific parts of the city, Stewart Street. It's really lumpy up there, especially going uphill and on the left. My expectation, because there's quite a lot of work going on at Stewart Street right now, is that expected to be completely be resurfaced in the near future, or what is the plan?
Yes, that is.
Thank you.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, it was just a question relating to you were saying that there was an increase in cycling in the weekends and that sort of thing. Would it be fair to say, and I sort of think of myself, I ride a bike occasionally, and I probably hadn't done it for a long time, but I got back into it. Do you think that the increased use of cycleways and weekends will actually lead potentially to people using the cycleways during the week as well, or is that too big a stretch to make?
It could potentially. I would say yes, because I think with the uptake on the e-bikes as well, people find it really easy to get around, and therefore might consider going to work on their bike.
Very good. Okay. Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about a comment in the narrative on page 233 about the Central City project. You refer here to the three waters and transport upgrades. I, like everyone else, I assume, has made the assumption that in George Street anyway, all services that need replacement would be replaced. So we know there are new water pipes and stormwater and foul sewage pipes. Does that also apply to other services that might be in place, such as fibre and electricity cabling?
Josh is right behind you.
So the team coordinate with other service providers and tell them when and how we're opening up the road, and then they provide feedback whether they want to get involved in the project or not.
Okay, and what's the situation with, say, Aurora about the replacement of electricity infrastructure?
I think...
We are coordinating with them, and we are installing some ducts for their future planning going forward. So we're talking with Aurora for George Street and their surrounding network as well.
That partially answers my question. So obviously there will be some new infrastructure that it will be stupid to replace, but others it's more aged. But the possibility of an early intrusion into the new work is being safeguarded against. Is that a fair way of putting things?
We're future-proofing.
Yes.
If we're saying the same thing, yes. Yes.
And does that also apply to telecom services, such as whatever fibre is buried?
Yes.
Okay. And is there any gas reticulated in George Street?
There are old gas services through there, but there's no reticulated gas that we're planning to renew.
I think that covers my questions. Thank you very much.
If you can just stay there, because I just want to follow up with Councillor Benson-Pope's question, and it's specifically around Aurora. There is a rumoured very big high voltage distribution line somewhere, and I'm not sure where it is. And I thought that it ran down George Street, and it purportedly is getting near end of life. Can we get absolute confirmation that is like written confirmation that they know where that line is and it's nothing to do with George Street? I just feel a lot better if I had that.
I can give you written confirmation that we are dealing with Aurora.
There's a report coming to council that we're just working with them on at the minute about replacing the big substation-y thing, technical words, in St Andrew Street, which is the main cable as I understand it. And so, but that
Okay,
work's
so
just
it's there somewhere.
Yeah, but that will come to council because an easement will be required from council, but that's just not quite ready. And that hopefully is written confirmation enough, that report.
Oh, it should be. I've got the same concerns Councillor Benson Pope has. Is just want to absolutely be certain that we're not going to see a Aurora truck turn up 5 years later.
So we are doing everything we can to future-proof the treatment we're doing to George Street. That said, something might happen, that we haven't planned for, but we've done everything we can to mitigate digging it up again in 5 years.
Yeah, I'm not thinking force majeure. I'm just thinking. Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. Couple of questions. In the paper recently, our bus drivers have been talking about bus stops and when we redo roads, integrating our planning around the road with the buses. And I was just wondering what work we're doing in that space.
So we're definitely actively looking at when we touch the road whether the bus stops need to be looked at the same time.
Thank you.
Is there a way to get a sign-off from the bus users group or the bus companies that in fact they are happy with your determination of yes or no on that?
I think that could be quite complex given the fact that they're not all one union.
But if I could just check with Mr Drew, I understand there are standards that we apply for when we're creating them, the new bus stops like in, is it Great King Street, for example?
The best practice guides.
We're certainly following those, and those guides will have been consulted on with respective disability groups.
I feel that the questions come back is things like the work that's going on up in Roslyn right now, where we're doing quite a lot of work on resealing and putting, redoing the footpath. That the bus drivers union said they've come back and found that the bus has been redrawn out again exactly as it was before, and it's still non-compliant with the new standards. So my impression I was getting is there are two activities working at the same time. And that one is bus renewals and new bus stops, and there's no complaints there at all. The other one is reseal and resurfacing work. And when that's going on, there isn't a redesign of the bus stops when it's done. Is that an accurate assessment?
That is definitely something that we're trying to address now, Councillor O'Malley. Yep.
Thank you. Councillor Radich.
Yes, just a couple of curiosity questions. The substation on St Andrew Street, is that the underground one outside Starbucks?
It's above ground as I understand it. Half and half.
Right, but is that one just outside Starbucks there? Or something? Yeah. Okay.
But that's not the one, right? That's the one on the one-way north.
Yeah, no, I
It might be a much bigger one.
It's a decently sized one, and we've asked Aurora to do some work to ensure that there are urban design considerations as part of what they're proposing to replace the one that needs replacement, rather than just like with like, because if we're spending $28 million to refresh the centre of town, it seems odd that we don't take that opportunity to at least have an attractive piece of infrastructure if we can.
We also had some information, many months ago about raising substations above ground. So that one outside Starbucks is all underground, the one that I'm thinking of. So raising them up so that they're easier to access for Aurora people, but not necessarily more favourable for pedestrians. Do you have any comment on that or any knowledge of that?
What I would say is we will work closely with Aurora when it comes to the replacement of infrastructure or any of our infrastructure partners to ensure that we have practical outcomes that work for them, but also good urban design outcomes.
Okay. Back to Stewart Street. Thank you for your very concise earlier answer. Could you further answer, when do you expect the work on Stewart Street to be completely finished, roughly?
Well, I'd have to double check that with the team, Councillor Radich, and I'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Councillor Houlihan.
And I've got one other question after that. I'm just wondering how it got to the point where the bus drivers felt they had to boycott those stops. Did we have a breakdown in communication, or what was the process there? Why did it get to that point?
I think the bus drivers were wanting to make a point in boycotting those stops. That was the way they thought they could best make their point.
Have they raised the issues with us previously, and what have we responded?
They raised some issues with bus stops in the last annual plan, and we have a program where we were addressing them, but that program wasn't progressing at a speed that satisfied their concerns.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. My next question, and I couldn't, once again, sorry, I couldn't hear overly well, but and maybe Councillor Gary raised this, I'm not sure, but I've been in communication with a woman in Mosgiel who is asking people to take photos of the footpath and the paves, and she's had some, she's fallen a couple of times and noticing cracks and broken pavers. Have we, in advice of you, send the photos on to council as evidence that the area needs to be repaired? Have we got any plans to do upgrades around that, you know, the main street and on the pavers and the footpaths and things in Mosgiel?
Sorry, Councillor, you mean in Mosgiel, sorry. Yes, so we are actively looking at the footpaths in Mosgiel at the moment.
Oh, brilliant, thank you.
And I'd encourage that individual councillor to call the DCC help desk. Where there are safety issues, we respond to them very promptly.
And Mosgill's on the urban centres list for upgrades. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Page 233, point 31, Green Island Road Safety Improvements. Question through the chair to Mr. Drew, wanting to know how those are progressing and the effects on the businesses in Green Island.
Yeah, we're working with the affected businesses, doing everything we can do to minimise disruption for them. Putting in infrastructure like this is always disruptive, so it's challenging, and we acknowledge that it's challenging for the business as well, but we are trying to put in some new measures for the coming weekend or the weekend after, and we're trying to provide them with similar access to business support that's been set up for the George Street project, in addition to all the stuff that that team have already done.
Thank you.
Councillor Radich.
Yeah, regarding that, I've had a few people talk to me about the Green Island thing and had a look there myself. Regarding that, would it be feasible to trial the e-texting communication system that was earlier talked about today by Councillor Gary in that area of Green Island, because there are not that many people directly affected, and I think they'd very much appreciate that direct communication about what was happening and when it was likely to, when changes were likely to be happening.
I'll look into that, Councillor. That's a good thought.
Any more questions? Councillor Elder.
Just looking at the Harbour Link Cycleway project and next steps to complete Wycliffe Street pedestrian crossing, is there going to be a crossing that has lights on it along that area, especially coming from the peninsula? Because sometimes there's really heavy traffic.
My understanding is the crossing point is at St Andrews Street and there's a new gate there. I'm not aware of any other crossing points. No.
No. Okay, so the safety aspect of that is the crossing at, I've forgotten the street.
St Andrews Street intersection.
Yes, St Andrew. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
That's all from the university down to St Andrews Street, isn't it? Yep. Any more questions? Very good. I shall move this now. I move that the committee notes the update reports of the reserves and recreational facilities, waste management, property, 3 waters and transport activities as provided in attachments A through E. Seconded, Councillor Radich. Does anybody want to speak to this? Councillor Vandervis.
Sorry to disappoint you at lunchtime, but there's a couple of brief points.
Got one more item.
The first is that in many, many years of sitting around this table and hearing all sorts of targets and aspirational goals regarding diversion of recycling, we are looking at a stubbornly low 12-13% for many years now amount of diversion, and we still have a target of 70%. To me, the amounts of money, the amounts of time, and the number of aspirational goals that have been pushed in this council have just simply not eventuated in any positive, tangible outcome at all. And I think we should either recognise that we can't do the job, or let Nash and Ross or someone else try and do it, because we certainly haven't been able to. In terms of the amount of waste going to landfills, I find it very surprising that our landfill manager has apparently no real idea of how much is going to the Nash and Ross landfill. I think for us to make reasonable decisions about Smooth Hill, for us to make reasonable decisions about where we invest our money, either in trying to extend the Green Island consent or build an entirely new landfill, when we remain virtually entirely ignorant of the major mover of waste landfill in Dunedin, right on our doorstep. To me, this is an extraordinary state of affairs. I've written twice now to the Chief Executive trying to get some sort of reasons for why we haven't been told about the scale of the Nash and Ross operation, why it is we've priced ourselves off the market for a lot of waste disposal. We have seen through our papers the loss of anticipated millions that we used to get through the landfill that we're now no longer getting. All of these are very serious, major budget issues that this paper, I think, gives evidence of. You're talking the graphs 3 and 4, and we simply aren't responding to, and it's almost as if we have a don't want to know attitude to the major developments that have been going on in this space. I'm hoping that somebody gives us the information that I've been requesting. If not, I'm going to have to make more public statements like this one and say, why is it that we're investing up to $50 million in Smooth Hill when it appears we have a local option that hasn't been presented to us? Thank you.
Your Worship.
Thank you. And the advertisement for Nash and Ross is noted. The question...
Point of order.
I'll withdraw. The question...
Thank you for withdrawing, Your Worship. Please refrain in future.
Okay, let's just get on with it.
The point's been made by Councillor Vandervis that we don't know what goes through the gate at Nash and Ross, and that somehow that is our staff's fault, and that it's a sad state of affairs that we don't know. The fact is that Nash and Ross, as a private waste operator, aren't required to tell anybody what goes through the gate at that facility. That is the point of the Ministry for the Environment's review that looks at, among other things, compulsory reporting on waste that goes through all landfills, whether they are municipally controlled or privately run, because currently we are not operating within a level playing field as a landfill operator. Among other things, and ETS charges and others that are only levied on, at this point, municipal waste. And we are being asked to consider, rather than developing our own landfill capacity, sending our municipal waste to a private landfill operator that isn't consented to receive municipal waste. And so that to me would seem a fairly solid foundation on which staff might base not making that a recommended option for us to progress. All I did want to say, though, in speaking to the report itself, and it's sadly unemboldened on the list of other areas of work, a small point 15 on page 197 within the Waste and Environmental Solutions Work Programme. The One Coast Community Group has begun waste minimisation activities on the recently redeveloped area of the Waikawati Transfer Station, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all of those involved in that community project for their patience and perseverance. It has taken a considerable amount of time to get to that one line in this activity report, but it was certainly something that I welcomed reading, and so thank you to the community involved and to staff who have been actively involved in making that happen over recent years. Thanks.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Chair. And following on from His Worship's comments, I note that we, in this activity report, we are on the right trajectory in some areas, and one of those is the solid municipal waste figures are really quite encouraging. I was really surprised, and the proof will be in the final year figures. Also was pleased to see there the rural recycling trials, based on some that have already been done and the success with those, and the point made by His Worship around local efforts. I do believe that local people and local communities will be important to our waste minimisation going forward and our waste management going forward. And I think our community is ready for the initiatives that we have coming up. And so for Councillor Vandervis to say, make the comments he made, I find difficult and challenging, because I do believe we have the plans in the new resource recovery facilities we have planned, and the curbside contract that will come into force next year. And I think our community is really waiting for that. And just turning attention to transport, there's one comment I want to make, and that's in relation to the cycleways. Build it and they will come. And that's been shown in the figures we've got today. And I look forward to the more meaningful questions that we will ask in the future around levels of satisfaction from our community, because I think they will result in more meaningful data for us to discuss. Thank you.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about what I'm seeing, or the data's not super clear with just the short plan, but it was what I referred to earlier. It's the difference of planned maintenance going ahead and less reactive maintenance because things are breaking down. It appears that the council decision 5 years ago or whatever to put significant increased budget into capex and to renewals is starting to pay off, and as everyone knows, it's much better to be planning ahead and buying new stuff for your business rather than just hacking around with the old and having breakdowns all the time. So it's good to see what looks like a positive trend.
Thank you. Any others?
Talking to strategy, it's really neat to see that the strategic review of playgrounds and the implementation of playgrounds across the city is happening. Good feedback on the safety and upgrades, but really neat to see the ground being dug on really amazing community infrastructure, and that's Bathgate Park and College Street. So really, really happy with that.
Any more speakers? I've done it yet again for the third meeting in a row where I didn't open up, and I'm just doing my right of reply. It's very efficient, and actually it's probably better just to wait for others to speak as it was with the questions in item 8. I want to start on the three warders commentary that Councillor Lord just made then, and I do want to take my hat off to them. They have worked very hard over the last couple of years to get the strategic plan in place, and I think item 8 earlier on today is a good example of how that work is playing itself out, and we are seeing it in the statistics that are showing up. The commentary I made about the Auditor General's report on our stormwater system was in fact that we, at that time, and that was 4 years ago, they were looking for more reporting on the actual ability of the system to meet its standards, and in fact their reporting now is starting to reflect those lines. I also too want to bit of a shout out to Judy Martin and the One Coast team. I was involved with them early on when they were interacting with the council as my role on the Waikouaiti Coast Community Board, and I just want to say that they have really plugged at this and done a really great job of getting themselves going out there. They want to be involved more in the green waste processing, and I'm hoping that we can also make sure that happens to meet a lot of our objectives around proximity principle and other such things. And further on to where we are with waste environmental solutions, we're about to get a briefing on our Waste Futures Plan, and our Waste Futures Plan, I think, will have a lot of the diversion activity in it. I'm hoping that when I see it, that the enabling of communities is sitting in that plan, but we'll see. But the fact of the matter is that until we build those new facilities, which is in the 10-year plan, we're not going to have the impacts on diversion that we're looking for, but we should be getting them as soon as they come in. Diversion is not putting it in somebody else's hole, so just sending it over to Nash and Ross is not a diversion, right? And I think it's been stated a number of times already, and I wish that when they had gone to the media about us, they had noted that they were not a Class 1 landfill. They cannot accept municipal waste. Therefore, they cannot be considered until they became a Class 1 landfill for what was going on in Smooth Hill.
Point of order. What they've clearly made clear of is that they will be able to accept food and medical waste, which they can then forward to AB Line if they are given that opportunity. So they would be able to, in fact, deal with all of the waste.
So the point of order, though, then is that they want to be a transit facility.
Only for that small amount of food and medical waste. They do everything else,
Oh, I think
including
we're getting
green
too much
waste.
detail on the point of order, to be honest. But I will step back from that and just reiterate to that His Worship pointed out that the reason that we do not know what private providers take into their landfills is that they are not obliged under the current laws to provide us with that information. It's just my speech, and unless I've said something that's a point of order, it's just my speech. I am comfortable with our relationship with the providers in the area. I have made my position on our timing for Smooth Hill a long time ago, and that's moot now. That was 3 to 4 years ago when I pointed out the time was running out on us. We are now moving forward with it as we have it, and I would look forward to the idea that we are investing more and more and more into diversion. So I'm looking at the Waste Futures Plan as it comes out to make sure it's meeting those objectives. We still cannot lose sight of zero waste as being our target. We are going to run out of time, presumably, on Green Island, so therefore we do have to have something, and we have considered all the alternatives, but we should be looking in the 30 or 40 year horizon that we are not using those facilities in any meaningful way anymore because we are diverting substantially more material. All in all, thank you very much for the report. I do think that having them grouped together, as I've said in the previous 2 meetings, makes for a difficult end of speech, because if you're first up, you're probably not getting much spoken about you. But I also acknowledge that, you know, at 1:05, this is a very long meeting, and we still have one more item to go. So I'm going to put it, all those in favour, against, carried, and on to the last item, which is item 12, Major Projects Update. Mr. West and Mr. Von Pine will be talking.
Before you speak, I will just remind everybody that to some extent this was a request that I've been putting forward, that I want the major projects to be reported on so we know that they are actually moving along. It is not intended to be a relitigation of the project or asking what colour paint we're going to be using or any other such things. So if you just give us a quick update. Thanks, Mr. Von Pine.
Happy to take questions.
Okay, questions. Any questions? Councillor Alder.
In the status of report, we're working on the single stage business case, and I'm just asking a question. In the single stage business case, there's like a list of criteria, so you tick all the boxes, and the more boxes you tick, the better it is. I was just wondering, in your conversations with Waka Kotahi and looking at all the boxes, what do you believe this, how do you believe this project ticks those boxes, I suppose? In your conversations with Waka Kotahi, what are they thinking?
Very holistically, there's it improves travel time and allows commuters to get from Mosgiel, Green Island, and Abbotsford through to the city and back. So that travel time saving is a big one. There's a safety improvement by taking the cyclists and cyclists and pedestrians off the road, and there is also a health and safety benefit or a well-being. There's an element of recreation that can be looked at as well.
So broadly, on that basis, we think that it meets the Waka Kotahi criteria for co-funding. But once we submit the business case, we'll know for sure.
Councillor Radich.
Just some interpretation questions of the graph. So page 236, we have this schedule here. How does the timeline work? So for instance, I'm looking at 2023. That mark on the line, does that signify January, 31st of March, June? When in 2023 does that, the mark for 2023 sit?
That is a rolled up version of the schedule, so that won't give you that specific information. It is available, but yeah, it doesn't. You can't interpret it from that graph, if you will.
All right. So what that means is the developed design will not necessarily be done by the beginning of 2023. It's just rough enough.
It is a broad indication at the moment. We won't know until we get the detailed design back.
That's fine. It's just an interpretation of the graph question. So, however, going deeper than that, sometime in 2027 is the projected ETC, estimated time of completion.
Correct. That's the current projection.
Great. That's good to see. But you won't, and starting it sometime the end of next year.
Dependent on the result of the business case, but correct. That's the current status.
I just want to make sure that my interpretation of the graph is correct, and thank you for just covering that.
If I just had one more comment on that, there are several more levels of information underneath that, so it's just again what we present and.
Yeah, well, it's indicative at this point, of course.
Correct.
Thank you.
For the layperson, the cumulative cost profile is sort of proportional to the amount of capital works that are going on.
Correct.
Thank you. Probably no more questions. It's a very early project. Any more questions? Very good. Then I move that we note the update report on the tunnels project as provided in attachment A, seconded by Councillor Radich. Anybody wish to speak to it? Excellent. I shall put it. All those in favour? All those against? Carried. That brings us to the last item, items for consideration by the Chair. I just have one question, and that is there are a couple of outstanding items for consideration by the Chair, and they're not noted on the items for consideration by the Chair. So when did they come back to this meeting? One was Ms. McDonald at the last
meeting asked for an update on where the Karatani Wharf was, with status and what was going to go forward with that. And then there's another one, it was about cross-reporting between community grants and infrastructure related, such as waste minimisation grants.
We'll follow up on that. I'm not sure how the GSOs are capturing them on the request, but I'll follow up with them and ensure that we've got something that's consistent across the committees. But a couple of those items, it would seem, are not report type items, but that would just be an email update to
What's
councillors,
short of
for
having
example.
asked for a report, really, I think, yeah.
So, yeah, they're not report items.
So we have to figure out a way to get them back, otherwise it'd have to be a resolution for a report, and I don't really want to have to go down that path.
Yeah, and then I don't want to be in a position where we don't write a report when one's not,
Yes,
needed.
exactly,
So.
100%. Are there any items for consideration for the chair? Then I call this meeting closed.
Can we determine Claire, what time will P&E start? No, but what time will P&E start? It's advertised to start.
Yep.
All right, I'll call to order today's meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee. And I'll move that we adjourn until 1:45. Seconded by Councillor Walker. Any discussion? Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. That's agreed.